A quiet Tokyo winter. Two strangers meet by chance in a freezing park, over something spilled and unexpectedly shared. One is quietly adrift, the other is deaf, and her particular stillness is something he did not expect to need. What follows is slow and tender. Evenings together, typed words, and something he learns in secret that changes what he can offer. Listen for the moment honesty arrives unpolished, and for one sound she has kept sealed for years, offered into the cold. Close your eyes now. Let the winter light and the quiet between these two carry you gently all the way into sleep. Somewhere in a small, mostly silent park in western Tokyo, on a bench that had been cold since before he arrived and showed no signs of warming, a 33-year-old man named Kenji was spending his lunch break doing almost nothing at all. He worked at an office not far from here, in a management role of the kind that involves many emails and very little that feels like it matters. And lately, over the past several weeks, the slow accumulation of that imbalance had settled behind his eyes and stayed there like something he could not put down. So on this particular afternoon, he had come outside, not with any real plan or destination, simply because the office had a quality of recycled air and fluorescent stillness that sometimes needed to be stepped away from, and the park with its bare winter trees and its one sleepy crow somewhere in the branches felt like a reasonable somewhere else to be. He was not quite thinking, not quite resting, just sitting in the particular way a person sits when they have set their thoughts down somewhere and are not yet ready to pick them back up, holding a can of coffee in both hands that had long since gone cold. Pause. The park was mostly empty at this hour, which suited him, and the ginkgo trees stood in their patient, bare-branched way against the pale winter sky, and along the path in front of the bench a sparrow was conducting the small and unhurried business of a sparrow's afternoon. It was into this stillness, this gentle, slightly numb stillness, that a young woman appeared at the far end of the path, coming from the direction of the vending machines near the park's entrance, walking with a slightly inward quality of attention and carrying a large bottle of Dr. Pepper. Breath. Kenji noticed her in the slow, unfocused way that a person notices things when they're not quite paying attention. First at the edge of his vision, and then more fully because she had a way of moving that was unhurried, in particular, her gray coat the same soft shade as the winter sky above the park. She looked to be around 30, he thought vaguely, in the absent way people make estimates they have not quite decided to make. And she was looking at her phone while she walked, which was, he would think later, probably the explanation for what happened next. He did notice the Dr. Pepper, though, because Dr. Pepper was a subject on which Kenji held a conviction that was, in his own quiet estimation, completely settled. It was the finest drink ever produced by human civilization, and he had held this view for 20 years with no intention of revising it. Pause. Her foot caught something, a raised edge of pavement, perhaps, or the accumulated inattention of walking while looking elsewhere, and the large bottle left her hand and described a brief, unhurried arc through the cold air, as though it had all the time in the world. It came down mostly on her, the front of her gray coat, her scarf, her sleeve, and then the bottle struck the concrete path and rolled in a slow half circle, its remaining contents spreading darkly across the ground, until it came to rest quite peaceably against the foot of the bench where Kenji was sitting. She stood for a moment looking at herself, and her expression was not distressed exactly, but it carried the weary resignation of someone who is finding this particular afternoon more eventful than they had been hoping for. Pause. Kenji was on his feet before he had quite decided to stand, his hand already finding the packet of tissues in his coat pocket, because he always kept tissues in his coat pocket, a habit from years of Tokyo winters that had simply persisted long past any conscious decision to maintain it. He crossed a short distance between the bench and where she was standing and held out the tissues and asked if she was all right, with the mild practical helpfulness of someone acting on instinct before their thoughts have had time to catch up with their legs. She did not answer, and in the small social gap where a response would ordinarily arrive, nothing arrived, and he felt a faint and mild confusion settle in. Not offense, nothing like that, just the gentle disorientation of a signal that had been sent and had simply not come back. Breath. She had been looking down at her coat when he arrived, and now she looked up and noticed him standing there, and something shifted in her expression. Something small and careful, a private adjustment. And then she raised one hand near her mouth and made a quiet, deliberate crossing gesture. Just that. A single small sign, the gesture of someone who has explained this particular thing many times and has arrived at the most efficient and least dramatic way of doing it. And Kenji looked at her hand and then at her face and, in the space of a breath, understood what she was telling him. She could not speak, had perhaps never spoken, and the sign she had made carried all of that, the fact of it and the complete ease with which she had delivered the fact in one small movement of her hand near her mouth. Pause. He stood there for a moment with the tissues still extended in his hand, and his mind did the quiet recalibration that minds do when a simple situation turns out to contain a layer not visible from the outside. Not distress, just adjustment, the small mental work of finding your footing in unexpected ground. The ordinary thing to do, he recognized, was to hand the tissues over with a kind nod, allow her a moment to gather herself, and make his way back to the bench and the cold coffee and the remaining minutes of his lunch break, which is what most people would have done, and which he probably would have done on any other afternoon. But his gaze had dropped just briefly to the Dr. Pepper bottle resting against the foot of the bench, and he had seen the label clearly now, and something about that small particular fact made the ordinary thing feel, in some quiet and unreasonable way, like the wrong thing. Pause. He had his iPad in his bag. He brought it to read on lunch breaks, a habit of years, and he had it out and in his hands before he had quite reasoned through why, because some decisions arranged themselves faster than the explanations that follow them. He typed something and turned the screen toward her, and what he had typed was, as he would later acknowledge with a small wince of recognition, quite possibly the strangest opening he had ever offered another human being. That Dr. Pepper was the finest drink in the world, and he would maintain this position against anyone who wished to argue the point. She read it, and something happened in her expression, a slow and genuine movement, warmth spreading from somewhere behind her eyes outward, quiet and real and unhurried. And then she nodded once with the thoroughness of someone who is not being polite, but who genuinely, in the full sincerity of her being, agrees. Breath. And Kenji, standing in the freezing park with his iPad extended and the packet of tissues still in his other hand, felt something loosen very slightly in his chest. The tightening that had been living there for weeks, connected to the recycled air and the fluorescent lights and the slow accumulation of small pressures. It loosened just a little, just enough to notice. She took the tissues he had been holding out this entire time, quietly, with a small and grateful tilt of her head, and she began to blot at the front of her coat with the patient resignation of someone who knows the coat is probably finished, but is doing what can still be done. He stood there because leaving now felt wrong, and because staying felt right in a way he could not have explained to anyone, including himself, and he found that he did not especially need to explain it. Pause. He typed something else on the iPad, something that was, by any reasonable measure, quite forward to offer a stranger on a winter afternoon in a park, that this was his first time meeting someone who was deaf, and that if she was willing, he would very much like to talk for a little while. She read it, and she looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that was thoughtful, and something that might have been the very faintest quiet edge of amusement, and something more careful and private behind both of those things. And then she nodded. She reached into her coat pocket and found her phone, and she typed something, and when she held it up for him to see, what she had written was that this was the first time she had ever met someone who liked Dr. Pepper. Pause. Kenji read this and fell for the first time in several weeks. Something that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same general territory. A small involuntary warmth that moved through his chest and reached his face before he had quite decided what to do with it. She typed again, after a small pause. Her name was Hannah, and she was sorry about the bench and about the Dr. Pepper, which had not conducted itself with a great deal of dignity today. He typed back that his name was Kenji, and that the bench was entirely fine, and that the Dr. Pepper had honestly improved the afternoon considerably. And she received this with the small solemn nod he was already beginning to recognize. Not exactly agreement, but something like, "Yes, that is how things are, and it is enough to say so." Pause. They had moved at some point during these exchanges from standing in the path to sitting together on the bench, his bench with the abandoned cold coffee at one end. And he could not have said exactly when this shift had happened, only that it had, in the quiet, natural way that certain things resolve themselves without requiring a formal decision from anyone. The park was still and cold around them, and the ginkgo branches made their thin, patient lattice against the pale sky. And the sparrow had gone, replaced by two pigeons near the vending machines conducting a disagreement that involved a great deal of mutual puffing and very little resolution. There is something about typing. Kenji found something he had not anticipated that changes the pace of a conversation in a way that is initially strange but becomes, if you allow it, its own rhythm, a particular slowness that turns out to suit certain kinds of talking, certain kinds of thinking aloud. Breath. Each exchange is a small and considered thing, because it takes a moment to compose it, and so neither person says the very first thing that comes to mind. And in that gap between the impulse and the sent message, something slightly more honest tend to find its way through. She asked him via phone what had brought him outside today, and he typed something honest, that the office had been difficult lately in the particular way that is hard to explain because there is no single thing wrong, just a general accumulation that eventually makes a person need to sit somewhere cold and quiet. She read this, and she nodded, and she did not immediately try to fix it or minimize it or find the silver lining or offer reassurance of any kind. She simply received the information with the same solemn attention she seemed to give to most things, and he found this, to his own quiet surprise, enormously restful. Pause. He asked her how long she had been deaf, and she typed back that she had been born this way. And then, after a small pause, she added that she had always been this way, and it was simply how things were. And those two words, simply and how, carried in them a whole long history of having made peace with something that other people spent a great deal of energy feeling sorry about on her behalf. He looked at those words for a moment, and then typed that he had never thought about it before. What it would mean to be born into a world of sound, and to have no access to any of it, and that he had always assumed it would feel like absence, like something perpetually missing. Hannah read this, and she tilted her head slightly, and she typed back slowly and deliberately that absence was a strange word for something you had never had, because absence requires a before, and she had no before to measure against. And so the word did not quite fit the experience, however well meant. Pause. He sat with this in the way you sit with something that has quietly rearranged a corner of your understanding, not dramatically, just shifted it a degree or two into a slightly truer position than it occupied before. They typed back and forth after that about smaller things, what she did for work, what she enjoyed reading, whether she had been to this park before, whether winter parks were better or worse than summer ones for sitting and thinking about nothing in particular. She mentioned that she preferred winter parks to parks in other seasons because in winter they were honest, no flowers performing, no crowds, nothing pretending to be anything other than what it was, just trees doing what trees do when no one is asking anything of them, and benches, and the occasional crow who has no opinion about your feelings. Breath. Kenji typed back that he had never thought of it quite that way, but yes, that was exactly right, and she gave him the small solemn nod, and the pigeons near the vending machines finally came to whatever conclusion pigeons come to and flew away somewhere. And for a moment, neither of them typed anything at all, and the quiet between them was not, he found, an uncomfortable kind of quiet. It was simply the comfortable quiet of two people who have found, without planning to find it, that they are in agreement about the important things, which are perhaps not as few as a person might think when they're sitting alone on a cold bench wondering why the afternoon feels so long. Pause. He checked his phone at some point and saw that he was significantly over his lunch hour, and this registered as a mild and distant guilt that was then almost immediately overlaid by the observation that he did not especially want to leave, and that he was not entirely sure when that had become true. He typed that he should go, that he had been away longer than was strictly reasonable, and she nodded in the way she did most things without performance, without disappointment, just a quiet acknowledgement that things were as they were. And there was no difficulty in that. Pause. She reached in her bag and found a small notebook and a pen. She carried both, he would learn later, for situations where a phone was not quite the right instrument, where something needed to be written rather than tapped, and she wrote something carefully and tore the page out neatly and handed it to him. It was her email address, written in small and precise characters, the handwriting of someone who is careful with words that cannot be spoken. He stood and folded the small page and placed it in his coat pocket, and then he said goodbye, said it aloud, and registered for a moment the slight strangeness of that, saying a word she could not hear, and then was less troubled by it than he might have expected to be, because she was watching his face the whole time, as she had been watching it this whole time, with that particular quality of attention, and she understood. Breath. She lifted one hand in a small and unhurried wave, and then she turned and walked back the way she had come, her gray coat merging gently into the gray light of the winter afternoon, and he stood and watched until she reached the far path and was gone. Long pause. Then he turned and looked at the bench for a moment, the cold coffee at one end, the empty space where she had sat, and at the place on the concrete path where the Dr. Pepper had spread and was now drying slowly into a faint dark outline, the kind of mark that would be invisible by morning. He picked up the cold coffee can, which he had not finished and probably would not, and he walked toward the park gate with his free hand in his pocket, feeling the small folded page of notebook paper through the wool of his coat. The crow was somewhere in the branches above the path, calling once in its completely indifferent way, and then going silent, and the pale winter light moved through the bare ginkgo trees in the slow manner of winter light, illuminating without warming, which was its own kind of offering. Pause. He pressed his hand more firmly against the coat pocket as he walked, not deliberately, just the way the hand sometimes finds the thing it wants to confirm is still there, and confirmed it and kept walking. He thought, moving through the cold air, about the crossing gesture she had made near her mouth, so practiced, so entirely matter of fact, the gesture of someone who has explained this thing so many times that it requires no preparation and carries no particular weight. It simply is, and about the nod she had given when he typed his position on Dr. Pepper. He thought about what she had written about absence and before, and how much a person can say without making any sound at all, and how a conversation conducted entirely in typed words on small glowing screens in a cold park had managed to be, of all the conversations he had had in the past several weeks, the one that felt most like actually talking to someone. Pause. The tightening in his chest had not resolved. These things do not dissolve on a lunch break in a cold park, and he knew that well enough. But it had loosened several degrees from where it had been sitting that morning, rearranged itself into something slightly more bearable, or perhaps slightly more interesting than bearable, which was a different thing. He did not know, walking back toward the office in the pale afternoon light, what he would do with her email address, whether he would write that same evening or wait a day, or fold the page carefully and think about it for a long time before deciding. And this uncertainty sat quite peaceably with him, the way small uncertainties sometimes do when an afternoon has been unexpectedly generous. Some things do not need to be resolved immediately, and the park had shown him at least that much, gently and without any particular effort on its part. Breath. And so Kenji walked back through the gate and turned in the direction of the office, and the bare ginkgo trees stood in their patient winter lines behind him, and the bench sat empty in the pale light, and the faint outline of a spilled Dr. Pepper dried slowly on the path in the cold. Unhurried, the way things dry when no one is watching them. Long pause, and Kenji walked on, his hand in his pocket, the cold air around him the same cold it had been all afternoon, and yet the park behind him, empty now, quiet now, its sparrow gone and its pigeons settled somewhere else, felt, in some small and difficult-to-name way, less empty than it had been before, and that was enough for one winter afternoon, and more than he had come out expecting to find. Let that moment rest where it settled, still and quiet, the way a breath held too long finally finds its release into the dark. We stay with him a little longer, just here, just in the soft weight of what has passed. The night is not finished with its unfolding. There is more to come, gently, without hurry, the same hours moving through the same rooms, the same silence deepening around the same lives. So rest where you are. Lay your shoulders lower. Let the space behind your eyes go soft. There is no rush toward what comes next. It arrives on its own, as all quiet things do, carried on the slow current of the night. Somewhere in the city that evening, a man named Kenji made his way home through streets still cold enough to see his own breath, and he was not thinking about the woman from the park. He was thinking mostly about nothing in particular, the mild, undemanding emptiness a person carries when the day has been long and ordinary, when the walk home offers nothing more interesting than the low hum of passing cars and the smell of someone else's cooking drifting from a window left open a crack against the cold. He let himself into his apartment, set his coat over the back of a chair, filled a glass of water he didn't really want, and sat down on the floor with his back against the couch. And for a little while he simply stayed there in the comfortable, uninterrupted quiet of his own space. The lamp on the low table was warm. The sound from outside were small and familiar, and for a few minutes nothing was required of him. And then his phone made its small sound. Pause. He reached for it without urgency, the way a person reaches for things when they're not expecting anything in particular, and he saw the notification and felt, in the same moment that he recognized the unfamiliar address, the particular quiet fatigue of someone who had half expected this and had not quite finished deciding how they felt about it. Hannah had written to him that same evening, from the park or from wherever she had gone afterward. With the same unhurried patience she seemed to carry everywhere she went. He read it slowly, pausing between lines, and what she had written was not complicated. Breath. She said that it had been a while since someone had been kind to her. Not said dramatically, not in a way that asked for anything in response to the statement itself, just as a plain and honest fact, offered quietly and then set down. She mentioned that it had also been some time since she had talked with someone her own age, really talked, traded words back and forth across the small, warm distance of a table, and that she had enjoyed the afternoon far more than she had expected to. And then, at the end, she asked, simply, without pressure, with the gentle tentativeness of someone who has learned not to assume the answer, whether he might like to be friends. Pause. Kenji set the phone face down on the tatami and looked up at the ceiling for a long moment. The sensation that moved through him was not unkindness, not exactly, He was careful about that distinction, was aware of it, but it was something that lived in the same neighborhood, a preemptive heaviness at the thought of what friendship with Hannah would actually cost him in practice. His mind had already done the arithmetic, almost before he had consciously invited it to, the way the mind sometimes races ahead of the heart and runs the numbers without permission. There would always be the tablet between them, or the phone, always open, always waiting for one of them to type into it. Breath. There would be the particular rhythm of conversation without sound, the pause while she wrote, the pause while he read, the pause while he thought of a reply, the pause while he typed it, a pace so different from the easy back and forth he was used to that even imagining it now, alone in the quiet of his apartment, made him feel the particular weariness of someone who has agreed to climb a hill before confirming they want to climb it. He told himself, as he lay looking at the ceiling, that this was not a judgment of her. She had been quite pleasant, genuinely easier company than he had expected for an afternoon. But that pleasantness in an afternoon and willingness to sustain something ongoing were different propositions entirely, and he was not sure he had signed up for the second one. He told himself this was simple honesty, and that honesty was, in the end, its own kind of consideration. And then he put the phone where he could not see it, and he went to bed, and he did not write back that night. Long pause. The next day came the way days do when something small is waiting at the edges of them, fully, normally, with nothing in the morning light to suggest anything was different. And he went to work, ate lunch alone near the vending machines on the third floor, replied to messages from colleagues, came home, heated something up for dinner, and did not once open the message thread. He thought about the message once or twice during the day in a way that an unanswered thing can sit in the peripheral awareness without quite arriving at the center of it, not troubling enough to act on, not easy enough to fully set down. Pause. He told himself he would reply that evening, and then the evening passed, and he didn't, and the night folded quietly over it, and he slept. The second day was similar to the first in most respects, except that by the late afternoon the small weight at the back of his mind had acquired a slightly different texture, less like simple unease and more like the dry, uncomfortable awareness of a person beginning to suspect they are not quite behaving the way they usually do. He ignored this awareness with some success, and by the time he shouldered his gym bag and headed to the dojo that evening, he had almost managed to convince himself there was nothing particular to ignore. Daichi was already there when he arrived. Breath. Daichi was one of those people Kenji had known long enough to have dispensed with most of the formalities. A training partner from the martial arts years, still as direct as he had ever been. The kind of person who considers it a basic courtesy to say plainly what he thinks rather than what a person would prefer to hear, and who has never quite understood why others do not do the same. They warmed up side by side in the way of people who have done it many hundreds of times before, the familiar rhythm of it, the stretching, the footwork, the careful first rounds of contact. And somewhere in the comfortable, half-inattentive state of concentrated effort, Kenji heard himself talking. He had not planned to mention it. He was aware, in a distant way, that he was not planning to. And then he did anyway, the way things sometimes find their way out when the body is occupied and the guard comes slightly down. Pause. He described the park, the cold afternoon. The woman named Hannah who had spilled her drink all over herself. The half-hour of typed conversation over coffee. The message that had been sitting on his phone for 2 days without a reply. He was also aware, as he described it, that he was shaping the story toward a particular conclusion. Framing things the way a person frames things when they are hoping to be told that their mild unkindness is, on careful reflection, actually quite reasonable. Daichi let him finish. Pause. Then he was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone who is deciding whether to spend the effort. And when he spoke, he did not cooperate with the frame Kenji had been hoping to give him. He said, in the direct way he said most things, that none of it sounded much like Kenji, not the tiredness of it, not the 2 days, and especially not the elaborate mental arithmetic about inconvenience conducted before a single reply had been sent to someone who had done nothing worse than ask whether they might occasionally exchange a few words. He said that Kenji was making something very complicated out of something that was, when you looked at it plainly, quite simple. And then he added, with the measured patience of someone who considers this a reasonable observation and not a particularly harsh one, that Kenji was acting smaller than he was. Pause. Kenji kept his eyes on the mat in front of him and did not say anything for a moment. He was turning the word over, not the substance of what Daichi had said, which he could have argued with, but that particular word, smaller, which was different in kind from any of the arguments he had been running with himself over the past 2 days, and which had landed somewhere it was not easy to dislodge. He had thought, at length, about whether he was being unkind. He had argued against it, and the argument had held well enough. He had not thought, even once, about whether he was being small. Breath. That was a different conversation entirely, and he found he did not have a ready answer to it. They trained for another hour, and Daichi did not bring it up again, and Kenji did not bring it up again either. And when they parted at the entrance, Daichi simply nodded in the way he had of conveying everything he needed to convey in a single look, and told Kenji to stop overthinking it. Kenji said he wasn't overthinking it. Daichi said nothing at all to that, and walked off into the evening, and somehow the silence where a reply should have been was worse than any reply would have been. Pause. On the walk home, the city was doing what it does on a cold evening. The soft amber of restaurant windows, the sound of a bicycle passing, the smell of wet stone, and someone far off grilling something on a small grate at the edge of a convenience store. And Kenji moved through it all with his hands in his pockets, and the word smaller turning very quietly in the back of his mind. She had simply asked to be friends. That was the whole of it. Not a grand ask, not an imposition, not a request for anything he would have found difficult to give in any other circumstance. Just a woman who had spent a pleasant half hour in an unexpected conversation and who had gone home afterward and sat down somewhere and written, carefully and plainly, that she had enjoyed it and would like the chance to do it again sometime. And he had left that sitting unanswered for 2 days while he thought about the inconvenience of it. Pause. He reached his apartment and stood in the doorway for a moment, in the familiar smell of it, the lamp still off, the glass of water from 2 evenings ago still on the table where he had left it. And then he took off his coat, turned the lamp on, and sat down on the floor, and picked up the phone without putting it off any further. He opened the message thread and read her words again. and they were exactly as he had left them, unhurried, warm, asking for very little. And he felt the thing that had been building at the back of his mind settle more fully into what it had actually been all along. He thought about what to write for a long time. Breath. He thought of the smooth, non-committal reply. The one that did not quite lie, but did not quite tell the truth either. The kind of message that leaves everything technically open while communicating in the careful gaps between its words that the sender would rather not be held to it. He typed 2 or 3 versions of this kind of message, reading each one back before deleting it, and each felt like a different surface laid over the same avoidance. Polite, evasive, the sort of thing a person sends when they have not quite worked up the willingness to be honest about what they are actually feeling. He deleted them one by one, and the space where they had been was at least cleaner. Pause. And then, after a while, he stopped trying to craft something and simply wrote what was true. He began with the apology for the delay, a genuine one. He felt not the kind that serves only as a preamble to something else. And then he told her, as plainly as he could manage, that he was not sure how to respond. He meant something more particular by this than it might have appeared on the surface. Not that her message had been confusing, which it hadn't, but that the whole situation was newer to him than he had perhaps let on that afternoon at the park, and that he was still, if he was being honest, working out what he had to offer. He admitted this without softening it into something more flattering, that he found himself uncertain of his footing, that he wasn't sure what kind of friend he knew how to be in this particular circumstance, and that he wanted her to know this going in, plainly, rather than discover it later as an unpleasant surprise. Pause. He wrote at the end that he was sorry if any of this came across as rude, because that wasn't what he intended. He was trying, he said, to be straight with her in a way that he thought she probably deserved, even if it made him sound less sure of himself than he might have preferred. He read it back once, and it was the most candidly awkward thing he had written in years. Honest in the way that feels a little too visible, a little too much like looking at a person directly when the social custom calls for careful, courteous indirection. Breath. He sent it before he could talk himself into something more polished. He set the phone down on the tatami and leaned back against the couch and let out a breath that had apparently been waiting somewhere in his chest for the better part of 2 days. The lamp on the low table threw its small, warm circle across the floor, and outside the window the city moved through its usual evening. A car somewhere distant, the sound of footsteps passing in the corridor, the faint murmur of someone's television through the wall, and Kenji sat in the middle of all of it and felt the mild, clean discomfort of a person who has finally said something true after a few days of not saying it. Pause. It was not comfortable, not exactly, but it was lighter than what he had been carrying, and underneath the discomfort there was something else. Not certainty and not resolution, just the small, undemanding quality of a thing left in better condition than it had been, and the quiet sense that whatever came next, he had at least begun it from an honest place. The lamp stayed on for a long while after that, and the city went on murmuring outside, and Kenji did not check his phone again that evening. Only sat in the stillness and let the honesty settle where it had landed in the way of things that are true and have finally been said out loud. And that, for tonight, is where we leave him in the warm and ordinary quiet of a lamp-lit room, in the small hours after a difficult message sent, in the particular peace that sometimes follows, gently and without any fanfare, the moment a person decides to be a little more like themselves. Pause. Let that moment rest with you a little longer. There is no hurry here. No need to hold anything tightly. Simply allow what just unfolded to settle, the way still water slowly finds its level in the dark. You can take a slow breath now, if you like, and let your shoulders fall a little lower, your thoughts drift a little softer. The same night continues, the same quiet story still turning, unhurried, like pages in a gentle wind. We stay with them a little longer, with the silence that came after, with all that was left unspoken, and all that was understood without words. The night is still young, and there is more yet to find in the stillness. In a narrow restaurant on a side street in Tokyo, on a Wednesday evening in the middle of winter, a man named Kenji sat across from a woman named Hannah, and the air between them smelled warmly of cumin and something slow roasted, and the overhead light was the amber kind that makes everything look a little kinder than it is. He had spent some time choosing the place because the online reviews had mentioned wide tables and good lighting, and he had thought, in a way he could not quite articulate even to himself, that wide tables and good lighting might somehow make the evening easier. Several days had passed since the cold afternoon in the park where she had spilled her drink, since the improbable fact of shared Dr. Pepper had turned two strangers into something loosely resembling friends, and in those days they had exchanged emails, long, carefully composed ones of the kind that take 20 minutes to write and another 10 to edit down to something that sounds less deliberate than it is. He had written things in those emails that he would never have offered aloud to someone he had known for less than 2 weeks. And she had written back with a specific, dry humor about the city in winter, about certain shops, and the particular smell of cold on department store escalators. And he had found himself rereading her messages in the quiet hours after work. Not for information, but for something else. Something harder to name. Now, with real food arriving between them and real distance across the table, he was learning, in the attentive, somewhat resigned way of a person encountering a gap between expectation and reality, that email and dinner were not the same kind of thing at all. The table was, in fact, wider than most restaurant tables in a city where most restaurants have learned to fit more seats into less space. And when Hannah slid her phone across it with something typed on the screen, it arrived to him with the faint formality of a document being submitted for review, rather than the casual ease of a remark tossed between two people who know each other well. He read what she had written. Something light, an observation about the non-arriving before the curry, which she had noted with the small satisfaction of a person who regards the correct sequencing of bread and sauce as a matter of some importance. And he typed back that this was the natural order of things in a properly organized universe. She laughed, or something close to laughing, a small brightness crossing her face, a breath that was almost a sound, and she looked down at her phone to compose a reply, and in that brief interval Kenji became aware of his own hands, resting and used beside his water glass, doing nothing in particular. This was the part he had underestimated, the waiting. In an ordinary dinner, with anyone else in any other restaurant with the ordinary ambient noise of a weeknight. There was no waiting of this particular kind, or at least none that registered, because words filled the pauses, and the pauses were themselves a form of conversation. But here, each exchange had a distinct beginning and a distinct end. She typed and he read. He typed and she read. And between each of these small ceremonies, there was a gap in which he had nothing to do but exist in the restaurant and breathe the smell of cardamom and notice the table between them. He looked at the food, which was genuinely excellent, and then at the window where the street outside moved past in its ordinary winter evening way, and then back at Hannah, who was already composing her next message with a small private expression that suggested she was, by some considerable margin, enjoying herself. And this was the thing that complicated everything, the thing that snagged in him somewhere below the level of his deliberate thinking. Hannah was not struggling. She had spent her whole life in this particular mode of exchange, the written kind, the deliberate kind, the kind where words are chosen rather than simply produced. And she moved through it with a fluency that made his own participation seem halting and approximate by comparison. A tourist attempting a language he had only just begun to study. At the table nearest to them, a man and a woman of roughly his age were sharing something to drink, talking easily, one sentence flowing into the next without any apparent effort. And Kenji found himself watching them for a moment in the quiet way of someone observing something they had never quite thought to notice before. They probably did not think about it, those two. The simple fact that they could just say things that, is this too spicy, or did anything happen today, or should we order more, were all immediately available to them. The way running water is available, unremarkable until you try to imagine its absence. He watched them a moment longer than was polite, then looked back at his curry, which was warm and fragrant and had the kind of heat that lingers in the back of the throat in a comfortable way. And he thought that in some other version of this evening, he might have simply mentioned this to Hannah without having to reach for his phone. She slid the phone back across the table to him. She had written that the painter was the best she had tried in a long time, and that she had been nervous about suggesting Indian food in case he didn't like it, and that she was glad he had said yes. He read this and felt something twist gently inside him, a small pang he recognized but could not quite categorize because she had been nervous about the choice of restaurant, which meant she had thought carefully about it, which meant she was trying, and that was more than he had wanted to acknowledge in that particular moment. He typed that the painter was, in his informed opinion, genuinely life-changing, and she made the small brightness on her face expression once more, and he noted, privately and without attaching too much weight to it, that she had a very communicative face for a person who did not speak. The dishes came and went in the unhurried way that good Indian food tends to arrive, and they ate, and they passed the phone back and forth, and the conversation was he would turn this over later in the quiet of his apartment, trying to place it correctly. The conversation was actually all right. Better than all right in moments. She had particular things to say about the neighborhood, about a documentary she had watched over the weekend, about a small ongoing debate she was having with herself over houseplants and which variety made the better trade-off between needing less water and needing more light. And she wrote about all of it with a dry specificity that he found more amusing than he had expected. But the amusement came at a cost. He was also, underneath everything, quietly tallying. Every thought she offered arrived fully formed and complete, and he received it and then waited while she received his. And while he waited, he was aware of the geometry of it all, the table between them, its width, the particular quality of a space arranged to feel intimate, but which tonight had the character, for him, of a considerable distance. Outside, the city was conducting its usual winter evening business. Lights coming on in the buildings above the restaurants. The last pale gray of afternoon fading into something darker and more settled. A few bicycles moving through the cold on the side street with the patient mildness of people going somewhere without particular urgency. He thought about the walk he was going to take in a little while, the 10 or 12 minutes from the restaurant toward the station, and realized that somewhere in the background of his attention, underneath the curry and the phone and the rhythm of the exchange, he had already begun composing something. Not the specific sentences, not yet, but the shape of a thing, the general outline of a message you send when you want to close something gently, when you want to say that the past week had been unexpectedly pleasant, and also that it should probably stop here before it became something neither of them had quite signed up for. He considered the emails, the week of them, and how they had asked something of him that he had been willing to give a certain careful attention, a certain patience with the pace of things, and how dinner had asked for something similar, but in a form that felt, for reasons he was struggling to explain, considerably more wearing. Dinner was supposed to be the natural progression, the moment when careful written exchanges graduated into something warmer and less effortful. And instead it had turned out to be the harder thing, the part where the gap he had been maneuvering around became concrete and physical and approximately 3 feet wide. Hannah passed the phone again. She had written that she hoped he wasn't bored, and that she knew this was a different kind of conversation for what most people were used to, and that she appreciated him being patient with the pace of it. He sat with this for a moment, the phone in his hand, the warmth of the restaurant around them, Hannah watching him from across the wide table with an expression that was careful and, beneath the carefulness, quite open. He typed that he wasn't bored at all, which was true, and that he was glad she had chosen the place, which was also true, and he handed the phone back and watched her read it and recognized, in a small and not entirely comfortable way, that he had managed to be generous and honest at the same time, and that he could live with this combination. But the composing continued in some quiet back-of-mind place. The shape of the message, the careful closing, the thing you say when you want to thank someone and also, gently, to let them go. They finished the meal. They settled the bill with the mildly complicated arithmetic that two people work out when neither has decided who is supposed to pay, and then they were outside in the cold, the sincere, clear winter cold that Tokyo does well, the kind that reorganizes your thoughts and makes the air feel more honest than it did in the warm. Hannah had her coat buttoned to the top, and her breath was making the small visible clouds that cold air produces, and she was looking at her phone, and he thought she might already be composing something, and he walked beside her in the direction of the station. He did not reach for his own phone. He let the walk be a walk, a cold 10 minutes through a city going about its evening, a small interval of not exchanging anything, the kind of pause that costs nothing and asks nothing in particular from either person. The side street was lit from above with a string of small warm lights that some shop had put up before winter and not yet thought to remove, throwing a soft amber onto the pavement beneath their feet, and Hannah glanced up at them as they passed, with the quiet expression of someone noticing a small thing and being glad of it without needing to say so. He noticed the expression and then noticed that he had noticed it and set the observation aside without quite managing to set it aside completely. The message was still taking shape in him. Something honest, something that acknowledged the week without diminishing it, something that came to a close without announcing itself too loudly as a close. And he was in a distant and somewhat weary way still composing it. He would write it tonight, he thought, after the train, after the 7-minute walk from the station to his building, after the coat came off and the small lamp went on and the apartment settled around him in its familiar quiet. They reached the wider street that opened toward the station, and Hannah stopped and turned her phone toward him one last time. She had written that she had a good evening, that she hoped he had too, that it was fine if he found the whole arrangement a bit strange, because it was honestly a bit strange, and she had added at the very end a small drawing made with her thumb. Not quite a face, more the impression of one, with a lopsided expression that might generously be read as a smile. He looked at the drawing for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. Then he typed that he had had a good evening, and that she should get home before the cold became unpleasant, and she made the brightness on her face expression one last time before turning toward her own train line. And he watched her go, coat buttoned, phone in pocket, breath making its small clouds in the dark. And then he turned toward his. On the train home, in the warm and slightly overfull car that smelled of other people's long days, Kenji held the overhead bar and looked at his own reflection in the dark window and found that the goodbye message had gone quiet in him. Not absent, he was careful to be clear about this with himself. Not abandoned, still a reasonable possibility, still something he had every right to consider. But quiet, the way something goes quiet when something else has borrowed the same space. The something else was small and had no name yet. It was the lopsided drawing and the nervousness about suggesting Indian food and the line she had written about appreciating his patience. And none of these things was significant on its own, which was somehow, in a way he could not quite explain, precisely the point. He got off at his stop, walked to his building, let himself in, and turned on the small lamp rather than the overhead light, because the overhead at that hour always seemed like too much, and he poured a glass of water and sat on the edge of the couch still in his coat, which he had not yet thought to remove. The goodbye message waited in him with the patient quality of something that knows it has not been decided against, only set aside for the moment, and he sat in the small warm light and let the evening be an evening a little longer, without requiring himself to resolve anything. And that is perhaps exactly where we leave him tonight. Coat still on, water glass in hand, the city quiet outside his window, a lopsided thumb drawing still somewhere in his recent memory, and a message still unwritten, which is not quite the same as a message waiting to be sent. The curry had been excellent, the restaurant had been warm, and somewhere on a side street in winter Tokyo, a string of small lights had thrown their amber onto the pavement, and Hannah had looked up at them with the quiet pleasure of someone who notices small things and does not need to announce it. Some evenings close on a decision, and some evenings simply close, and this one for Kenji was somewhere between the two. The question still open, resting in him the way something rests when you have not yet found a reason to put it down. Let that moment rest where it fell, soft, unhurried, like the last note of a song that has already ended before you quite noticed it ending. The night is still holding them, holding all of it, and there's no need to move forward yet. Breathe here for a moment if you like, slowly, fully, with no rush at all. The same quiet continues to settle around them, the same still dark, the same gentle weight of all that is past, and all that waits just ahead, patient and close, as near as the breath you are already beginning to slow. In a small cinema district of Tokyo on a Saturday evening, Kenji walked along the pavement with his hands deep in his pockets, telling himself that agreeing to come had been the reasonable thing to do, and very nearly believing it. Hannah had sent the invitation 2 days earlier. Just a short message, cheerful and unhurried in the way she always was, suggesting Saturday, the cinema near the east exit, popcorn if he was interested, and Kenji had read it at his kitchen table and set the phone face down and sat for a long, considering moment with the thought. The thought was this, that a film would be almost nothing to someone who could not hear it, that the score was half the experience at minimum, that without the swell of music before something changed and the particular silence before something broke, a film was really only moving pictures, which was something you could see anywhere at any time for no cost at all. He had turned the thought over several times, in a way that feels like thinking, but is usually more like confirming something already decided, and had arrived, as he generally did, at the same comfortable certainty he had started with. Still, he had written back yes, because he was trying to be a decent person in the small ways that are available on any given day, and also because Hannah had asked with such natural ease that saying no had seemed less like a considered choice and more like a small meanness he would have had to sit with alone that evening. The cinema itself was modest, not the large multiplex near the main station with its brand-name coffee kiosks, but a smaller place with worn carpet and a lobby that smelled warmly of butter and cleaning solution, the kind of cinema that had been there longer than the buildings around it and wore this, quietly, as a kind of credential. Kenji arrived first and stood near the glass doors, watching the street outside in the early evening, where the light had gone from the last orange of autumn sun to the pale gray that follows it, when the warmth has gone and the city begins its slow turn toward night colors, the reds and ambers of shop signs, the white sweep of passing headlights on whetstone. Hannah arrived a few minutes after, wearing a coat the color of river water and a small bag over one shoulder. And when she saw him through the glass, she raised one hand in a brief wave and smiled. The small, unhurried smile she had that made apologies seem unnecessary, as though the world were generally going to be fine, and she saw no particular reason to doubt it. They bought popcorn and had a brief, good-natured disagreement about who would pay, conducted entirely through gestures and expressions and one mildly reproachful look, and Kenji lost in a way that left him feeling mildly outwitted but not unhappy about it. And they found their seats in the middle rows and settled in as the last of the lights went down. He watched the film and gave himself quiet credit for being present, which is a kind of enjoyment, but modest one. The mild satisfaction of doing a considered thing, of showing up and staying without the additional and somewhat unearned pleasure of actually wanting to be there. He was aware of Hannah beside him in the dark in the way you are aware of someone in a quiet room, when you're not quite looking at them, a peripheral warmth, a soft and steady presence at the edge of things, the small ambient sounds of someone settled and comfortable. And then, without any particular intention, he looked sideways. Hannah was leaning slightly forward. Just the tilt of her shoulders and the angle of her chin lifting toward the screen, and her face in the shifting, mobile light from the film was absorbed completely, the way a person looks when they have entirely forgotten where they are, when attention has become total and there is no performance left in it at all. He looked back at the screen because staring at someone absorbed in something they love felt like a kind of intrusion, the violation of a private space they have not offered you entry to. But a minute or two later, his gaze drifted sideways again, without his quite deciding to send it there. She was still exactly like that, turned completely toward the film, her popcorn held loosely in one hand and forgotten, her expression open in a way that asked nothing of anyone, a faint curve at the corner of her mouth at something on screen that seemed to have quietly amused her, and the thought that arrived in Kenji's mind, plainly and without much ceremony, was that she looked like she was having a considerably better time than he was. He watched her face shift as the scene changed, a brief stillness at something sad in the film, a slight easing at something that lifted, and he thought very slowly that she was watching something different from what he was watching. Not a lesser version of the same film. Not the film with something essential removed, but a different film built from the same images. One that lived in the face before the person spoke, in the light arriving in a room before anyone entered it, in the held frame that meant something by staying a moment too long. And whatever she was building from these things seemed full and whole and nothing at all like the diminished half experience he had assumed must be her portion of the evening. He ate his popcorn and watched the film and did not look at her again after that, partly because looking now felt like a trespass on something that was hers, and partly because he was sitting with the small, particular discomfort of a person who has been certain about something that is quietly revealing itself to have been wrong. When the lights came up, Hannah turned to him immediately and had her phone ready almost before Kenji had finished blinking, and she held the screen toward him with the expression of someone who had had a genuinely good time and assumed, with her characteristic warm certainty, that he had had the same. She had written that she had loved the ending, and that the actress in the second half had been extraordinary, and Kenji nodded and agreed, because the actress had been extraordinary, and because the evening had already, at this early stage, become something other than what he had prepared himself for. The cafe they walked to was a few streets from the cinema, a small place with mismatched wooden chairs and a blackboard menu and handwriting slightly too small to read from any distance, and windows that had gone clouded and soft with condensation on the inside, the way cafe windows do in autumn when the warmth inside meets the cold outside, and neither will quite give way. They ordered coffee and took a corner table by one of the fogged windows, and outside the street was quiet in the particular way of autumn evenings. Not the bright, restless quiet of summer nights, but the older, more patient quiet of the season that has run its full course and is simply resting now. Hannah held her coffee in both hands. She often held things with both hands, Kenji had noticed, as if warmth were a careful resource, and she was looking at the table surface for a little while in the way she sometimes did when she was composing something, and after a while she picked up her phone and typed for longer than usual. Then she turned the screen toward him. She had written that she had noticed him wondering. She could always tell, she noted, and she said this without any edge in it, simply as a fact, and that yes, even without hearing the film, it had been good, had been genuinely good, and she wanted him to understand why. She wrote that people always assumed the audio was the whole thing, that without it the experience must be like watching through glass, muted and distant and incomplete, but that a film was also the face of a person before they spoke, the thought arriving in the expression just before the words did, and it was the light falling in a room before anyone entered it, and the frame held deliberately long enough to carry meaning. And all of these things were as fully available to her as they were to anyone. Kenji read this carefully, the way he had learned to read things Hannah wrote, because she chose her words with some consideration, and moving through them quickly felt like walking past a painting at a jog, technically done, but not really experienced. She took the phone back and kept typing, and what came next was about concerts. She told him that she had been to live concerts over the years, more than a few, and that whenever she mentioned this, people would look at her with an expression she had come to recognize, not unkind, but uncertain, as if they were trying to understand what the experience could possibly mean to her, and what they were imagining, she was fairly sure, was a concert with the sound simply removed. But a live concert, she had written, was not only sound, it was the floor and the air and the low pressure that moved through your chest when the bass was very loud, before the ear had anything particular to say about it. And this pressure in the sternum and the vibration traveling slowly upward through the soles of your feet and into your legs was not a substitute for hearing the music, but was simply another part of the same real thing, arriving by a different path and landing in a different place. She wrote that standing in a hall where the sound was loud enough to be felt in the bones was not a lesser version of being there, but was one of the real versions of being there, specific, physical, worth doing, worth having done more than once. Kenji sat with this for a moment, the coffee warm in his hands, the fogged window beside him, the quiet autumn street outside visible in soft outlines through the condensation, and he thought about every concert he had ever stood in and called it a listening experience, without once pausing to consider what was happening in his chest. He ran back through those memories and added to each one what the bass must have been doing in his sternum all along, a constant, quiet physical fact he had been living inside without ever attending to it, the way a person lives inside, whether without thinking of themselves as doing so. And the effect was of suddenly seeing something that had always been present in the picture, but that he had simply never looked at directly. A background that turned out, on examination, to contain a great deal. He told her that he had not thought of it that way, and Hannah nodded in the way she had when she expected as much, unhurried, not unkind, the small nod of someone for whom this was simply one of many things the world had not yet gotten around to considering about her. Then she reached for the phone again, and this time the message was short. She wrote that written chat was honestly a real pain, and something in Kenji eased at that, some small held thing he had not quite known he was carrying. He replied that he agreed entirely, that sitting in a cafe, conducting what was essentially a conversation by typing it out word by word was, when considered plainly, a rather absurd way to be spending a Saturday. And Hannah nodded with the gravity of two colleagues confirming a shared professional grievance, which was a very precise expression for exactly what it was. There was something in that exchange, the directness of it, the mutual acknowledgement of the inconvenience without apology or cushioning, the ease of two people simply agreeing that something was difficult, that made the air between them feel lighter, the way the air in a room changes after a window has been opened and the old air has finally had somewhere to go. It was not that the inconvenience disappeared. The phone was still there on the table between them. The gap between thought and typed word was still real. The particular asymmetry of how they communicated was still a fact that every conversation they had would have to account for. But naming it together had changed its character, turned it from an awkwardness that lived on one side of the table into something more like a shared condition. And a shared condition, he found, sat differently than a private one. He thought about all the assumptions he had walked into the cinema with that evening. The popcorn bought for someone who would surely get little from the film itself as a courtesy extended rather than a pleasure shared, the text conversation as a burden falling more heavily on him than on her. Sitting across from Hannah in the warm cafe with the fogged windows and the autumn street outside, he could see that he had been wrong about most of this, not in a way that embarrassed him or required apology, but in the quiet, clear way that a small, confident mistake is simply wrong when the actual world shows up gently, directly, without any fuss. A room he had thought he knew the edges of had turned out, on reflection, to be considerably larger than he had mapped it. And that was simply that. Hannah was looking out at the street now, her coffee still held in both hands, her face still and easy in the warm cafe light, and outside the leaves were long since down, and the pavement was dark with evening cold, and the lampposts laid small, exact circles of gold on the whetstone. Kenji watched her for a moment, plainly, this time with no pretense of looking elsewhere, and thought that she moved through the world with a particular kind of calm that had surprised him the first time he noticed it, and which he now thought was simply what it was, not indifference, not resignation, but the ease of someone who had looked steadily and honestly at things as they were and had arrived, somewhere along the way, at a genuine peace with them. He did not have a word for what he thought about this, and he did not reach for one because he was not the kind of person who needed a word for something before he could sit quietly with it. And so he sat, and the cafe was warm, and the coffee had gone cool in his cup, and outside the city was going on with its evening in the patient way that cities do. They stayed until the cups were empty and then put on their coats and walked together toward the station in the night air, their breath just visible in the cold, the wet pavement shining under the lights in the particular way of autumn stone. They walked without reaching for their phones, which was also, in its way, a kind of conversation, the quiet agreement to let the walking and the cold and the lamplight be enough, the easy understanding of two people who had arrived somewhere that evening without planning it, at a place where the silence between them did not need to be filled. Later, on the train home, Kenji stood at the overhead rail and watched the city move past the windows in its evening sequence. Lights going out in the upper floors of buildings, the quieter rhythm of trains on the late line, the patient dark between stations, and thought about the floor of the concert hall. He thought about standing in crowds at concerts over the years, calling it a listening experience, never once pausing to notice what the bass had been doing in his sternum all along, the whole physical conversation that music had been having with his body while his attention was pointed strictly upward toward his ears. He thought about Hannah's face turned toward the cinema screen in the dark, finding the film and the faces and the light and the held frame in all the places he had never thought to look, and he felt, standing quietly on the train with the city moving past him, something that was genuinely close to gratitude. Not for a grand gesture or a revelation, but for a small and honest correction, the kind that feels, afterward, less like being told you were wrong and more like being shown a door in a room you thought you knew well, and finding that it opens without any effort, and that the air on the other side is cool and not unpleasant at all. The train moved through the city, and the evening continued in its quiet way. And Kenji thought that the night had been, in the end, something rather better than what he had brought with him. Lighter and wider, and open in the particular direction that comes from finding the world a little larger than the map you had been carrying. Somewhere across the same city, Hannah was on her own train home, heading back through the November night, having sat in a cinema and watched a film in her way, having held a coffee in both hands in a warm cafe, and told the truth about concert floors and sound pressure and the honest inconvenience of writing everything out, having spent an evening simply being who she was, and having been, from everything about her, entirely at ease with that. And that, perhaps, is where this evening rests. In two trains moving separately through a city, going slowly to sleep, and the small, uncelebrated fact that a man had walked into a cinema, certain he was giving something away, and had come home without quite understanding how, carrying something more than he had left with. Let that moment rest now, gently, the way a held breath finally releases into the quiet dark. We stay with them a little longer in the same soft hours, the same night still turning slowly overhead. There is no rush here. If you feel your eyes growing heavy, let them close. The story will carry you wherever you drift. Take a slow breath in now and let it go. The night is patient, and so are we, moving quietly through it together, unhurried, following the same delicate threads as they loosen and lengthen in the stillness, weaving the same life, the same unfolding. Let yourself settle. We continue softly. On a mild evening in late autumn, a man named Kenji sat in a parked car outside his younger sister's apartment building. Engine off, keys still in his hand, trying to work out exactly why he had driven here instead of going straight home. He had meant, as most evenings went, to go back to his own quiet apartment, to sit at his own table with the week unwinding around in the way it usually did at 33, when you had work and a routine and a generally reliable sense of where things stood. Something had been different for the past several days, though. Something small and persistent, the way a low sound becomes noticeable only once the louder sounds around it have finally gone. He had been at a cafe with Hannah 3 evenings before, and she had written on her phone in the matter-of-fact way she had of saying things that she went to concerts sometimes just to feel the sound moving through the air and through the floor and through the bones of her feet, and that it was one of the best feelings she knew. She had smiled a little after writing it, the smile of someone accustomed to mild surprise from other people. And Kenji had sat across from her and found himself thinking, in the quiet way that honest observations arrive when you are not looking for them, that there were people who carried their circumstances with a steadiness he had never quite managed, and that she was one of them. He had told her that same evening that the back and forth typing was sometimes tiring because he had gotten into the habit of telling her the truth, and she had typed back, without any ceremony, that it was tiring for her too. And there had been something in that shared admission, the simple naming of it, that had made the whole conversation feel lighter, as if a small thing sitting between them had been quietly moved to the side. He had driven home afterward and sat in the car outside his own building for longer than was sensible, doing nothing in particular, just sitting while the night settled around him. The next evening he had noticed, and then could not stop noticing, that when Hannah started to say something, her hands would sometimes begin to move before she caught herself and reached for the phone instead. A brief, automatic grammar that lived in her hands the way language lives in the body before it becomes sound. He had not understood a single moment of it, and now it was 3 days later, and he was still thinking about it. He got out of the car and went upstairs and rang his sister's bell. Aoi answered in a large sweatshirt with a cartoon bear on the front and a toddler balanced on one hip, and the expression of a younger sibling who knows, from long experience, when her brother has arrived with something to ask. She let him in anyway, the way she always did, and he settled on her small sofa while the apartment smelled of rice and warm laundry and the comfortable quiet of a household where small children have only recently been convinced to go to sleep. He asked her, because there was no more graceful way to begin, about the sign language club she had joined at school once years ago for the most practical possible reasons. The meeting room had a comfortable view. The requirement was easy, and she had never been someone who made choices more complicated than they needed to be. Aoi confirmed this without apology, adjusting the toddler on her hip, and mentioned that she had kept at it longer than expected and gotten reasonably decent in the slightly deflecting tone she used for things she had actually worked at. He told her he needed to borrow her textbook, and she looked at him for a moment with the steady patience of someone who has known you all your life and is therefore not going to rush past the interesting part. And she asked him simply who. He gave her the honest answer. There was someone he'd been spending time with. She'd been deaf since birth, and he was tired of watching her reach for a keyboard every time she wanted to say something ordinary. Aoi set the toddler down on the rug without making a production of the conversation, which was one of the things he had always appreciated about her, and she went to find the book in a cardboard box in the hallway closet. It came back dusty, a soft-covered manual with a cartoon hand on the front and pages already warped at the corners from years beside something damp, and she handed it to him with the casual directness of someone giving away something they were glad could still be useful. She mentioned, as he was putting his jacket back on to leave, that he ought to come back sometime so she could check his hand shapes. Apparently, there were forms deceptively similar to other, more alarming ones, and she said it with the comfortable amusement of someone who had made that kind of mistake in front of other people. He drove home with the book on the passenger seat, and he did not open it until he had made tea and sat down at his kitchen table with the lamp on and the rest of the apartment quiet around him. The first pages were simpler than he had expected. Letters, numbers, shapes that corresponded to syllables. And he worked through them slowly, not because they were especially difficult, but because he wanted to be precise in the careful way you are with something you have decided to take seriously before you have told anyone you have. His fingers were not initially cooperative, which seemed fair enough, given that they had spent 33 years doing ordinary things that required no particular attention to the exact articulation of a hand shape. He practiced in the mornings before work, at the kitchen table while his tea went cold beside him, and sometimes at red lights in the car on the way home, which he decided was marginally safer than it probably sounded. He kept the book in his bag and read it on lunch breaks in a way that he hoped suggested to the general atmosphere of the office that he was studying something very ordinary, which was in a sense true. Days became a week, and then more than a week, and the pages of Aoi's book grew softer from handling, the spine beginning to loosen, the cartoon hand on the cover developing a small crease where he kept folding it back to the same section. He learned the signs he thought he would want first: morning, evening, thank you, sorry, how are you? Not because those are the recommended order, but because those were the words that kept appearing in his mind as the ones he would choose if he could only manage to form them. He made mistakes and corrected them alone, and there was something quietly companionable about that, about learning something in private, for a reason he had not quite put into words for himself yet. He was seeing Hannah 2 or 3 evenings a week by then, eating or walking or sitting somewhere comfortable, and the phone still went back and forth between them, and it was fine. It had always been fine, except that he was becoming newly aware of what fine was costing her. He noticed a small pause before she looked up from the screen to see his reply, and he understood now that this was patience, the specific and practiced patience of someone who had been adjusting to other people's pace her entire life without considering it an adjustment. She was, as far as he could tell, genuinely content. She was not someone who made unhappiness available for inspection, and the ease she brought to their evenings seemed to come from somewhere real and internal. But he still saw her hands. He saw the brief, involuntary lift of them when she started to say something before she caught herself and reached for the phone instead, the body moving toward its own language before the mind pulled it back. And he thought about that sometimes, alone in the evenings with the book open on the table. The secret had a particular texture. Not the uncomfortable texture of keeping something back, but the careful texture of carrying a gift that was not ready yet, something you hold with deliberateness because you want to hand it over whole. About 3 weeks after his visit to Aoi's apartment, he had gotten through enough of the book that he could form simple sentences with some consistency, and Aoi came over one afternoon and watched him and told him he was acceptable, which was, coming from her, a fairly enthusiastic endorsement. She corrected 3 hand shapes that apparently, in certain contexts, carried meanings he would not want to accidentally convey, and she showed him how to ask questions, how to express uncertainty, how to convey something close to. I am still learning this, and I would be grateful for your patience. That last one he practiced until it came naturally. The small, honest admission of a beginner, of someone new at something and fully aware of it, because it was, of everything he had learned so far, the most true. The Thursday evening arrived without particular announcement, cooler than the days before it, the kind of early winter evening when the lights inside restaurants look especially warm from out on the street. They were at a place they had returned to several times already, a small restaurant near her neighborhood with wide tables and good light, the kind of comfortable place you find yourself going back to not because it is remarkable, but because it has become reliably itself. He arrived before her and sat by the window with a book in his bag, taking it out once to look at and then putting it back, not out of uncertainty, but out of the quiet sense that there was value in waiting for the right moment rather than manufacturing one. Hannah came in from the cold with her dark coat and the particular look she had when she was simply glad to be somewhere warm and to be meeting someone she liked. And she settled into the seat across from him and reached for her phone in the easy, familiar way that had come to feel, by now, like a kind of greeting in itself. They ordered, and they ate, and the evening moved through its middle section in the comfortable, unhurried way their evenings had been moving lately. The ease of two people who had stopped performing for each other and arrived somewhere quieter and more honest. It was when the food was mostly finished and the tea had arrived that Kenji reached into his bag and placed the book on the table between them. Always textbook, worn soft at the edges, the cartoon hand on the cover creased from 3 weeks of handling. He slid it gently across toward her, not all the way, just far enough that it arrived clearly in her space. And then he waited with the feeling of someone who has been carrying something for a while and has now simply let it go where it was meant to go. Hannah looked at the book for a moment and then at him, and she picked it up carefully and opened to the first page. And then she was very still, in the way someone becomes still when their understanding arrives a little before the rest of them. She looked up at him, and what came into her face then, he would come back to this later, more than once, was not dramatic, did not announce itself, was simply so completely genuine that it carried its own quiet kind of weight. Her eyes went bright, the particular brightness that has nothing to do with performance, the kind that happens when something unexpected turns out to be exactly right, and the surprise of it and the rightness of it arrive together at the same moment so that you cannot tell them apart. She picked up her phone and typed something and turned it toward him. And what it said was simply that she would love to teach him. He told her then that he had already started, that the book was his younger sister's, that he had been at it for about 3 weeks, and that certain hand shapes were, as it turned out, more technically nuanced than he had initially appreciated, which had been a learning experience in more ways than one. She read this and seemed to consider it. And then, rather than reaching for the phone, she set it down and opened the book to a page somewhere in the middle and formed a sign slowly in the air between them, with the careful patience of a teacher who is in no particular hurry. He recognized it, or something near it. He had practiced something adjacent, and he formed it back, imprecisely, the way you form something you have only ever rehearsed alone in a quiet room. And she reached across the table and gently reshaped his fingers into the correct position. without any fuss, the way you correct someone who is genuinely trying. When she looked up from his hands, there was the same brightness still in her face, or some version of it. The quiet warmth that comes from being met somewhere you had not expected to be met, in something you had thought, until now, was only yours. They stayed long after the tea had gone cold. The book opened between them on the table. Hannah teaching slowly and Kenji following with the deliberate attention of someone who has decided to learn something properly rather than quickly. She was an unhurried teacher. She had the patience of someone who understood in her whole body that things worth communicating were worth communicating with care. And under her guidance, the signs began to feel a little more certain, a little more his own, a little more like something he could actually offer. He found himself understanding, somewhere in that unhurried hour, something he had not quite grasped before, that a language spoken with the body is not a lesser kind of language, not a workaround or a compromise, but a different kind of fullness altogether. When they finally left, the city had settled into the particular stillness of a late winter evening, and they walked a few blocks together in a silence that felt, somehow, more full than silence usually does. Kenji walked home with the book in his bag, and the evening still warm somewhere in his chest, thinking about Aoi handing over the dusty textbook without making it into a moment, and about the weeks of kitchen table practice, and about all the small, unremarkable choices that had led, without his quite planning them to a Thursday night and a worn book slid across the table. He thought about her hands, the brief, involuntary lift of them in that cafe weeks ago, before she caught herself, and how that one small, unguarded thing had set something moving in him that he had been trying, slowly and imperfectly, to honor. He did not have a name, yet for what had been gathering in him across these weeks, the thing that had sent him to his sister's door and kept him at the table long after he should have slept, it was still in that early place where feelings live before they become words. But it was there, patient and settled, warm in a way that asked nothing of him yet, and the evening had made it a little more known to him. The way the same path walked many times becomes, one day, simply familiar. And that, for the night, was more than enough. The small brightness in her face when she had first seen the book, the warmth of her hands resetting his, the easy, unhurried walk through the cold city after. And it was the kind of more than enough that stays with you gently as you drift towards sleep, like a lamp left on in a room somewhere down the hall. And we let that moment rest, just as it is, unhurried and still, the way a candle flame settles after someone has passed quietly through the room. The same night continues to unfold around them, soft and patient, the same air, the same silence deepening at the edges. You can take a slow breath here, let your shoulders grow heavy, let your thoughts soften at the corners. There is no rush. The night holds everything gently, and the story is still with us, still moving forward the way a river moves, without effort, without urgency, carrying us along on its quiet, unhurrying current toward what comes next. In a small cafe near the station they always used, on an evening when rain had started softly against the windows without much urgency, Kenji sat across from Hannah and understood that his hands already knew what they wanted to say, long before the rest of him had decided to say it. He was 33 years old, and for most of those 33 years he had considered himself a reasonably practical person. Not the kind of man who found himself memorizing the particular way someone held a coffee cup, or thinking about a specific smile at 10 in the morning while waiting for a meeting to begin. Somewhere around the end of their third week of knowing each other, that had stopped being entirely true. The month had passed the way water slowly fills a new shape. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, finding the low places and settling into them without asking permission. He had borrowed a sign language book from his younger sister, who had joined a sign language club at school because the option seemed easier than most, and had then, with the stubbornness that ran through the family, become genuinely skilled at it. The book had sat on his coffee table for 3 days before he opened it, and when he did, he felt a small embarrassment at how much he wanted to, not out of any abstract sense of virtue, but simply because he wanted to talk with Hannah without always looking down at a phone, to be able to watch her face while the conversation moved between them. The first sign he learned was thank you, which seemed sensible, and the second was sorry, which his sister told him he would need more than he expected, and the third through fifth covered coffee, rain, and good morning, because those were the words that kept coming up in their evenings together. Within a month, he had perhaps 30 or 40 signs he could use with any confidence. Small, practical words, the kind that tell a person you're paying attention rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak. What he had not anticipated was how quickly she noticed. The first time he signed something to her across a cafe table, a simple gesture asking whether she wanted more coffee, she had gone very still for a moment in a way he found difficult to describe afterward, the way a person stills when they have been given something they were not expecting and haven't yet decided where to put it. She had nodded, and then signed something back to him, and her eyes had done the thing he was beginning to recognize, that quiet warming, that particular softening that arrived without any perceptible change in her expression. And Kenji had looked down at his notebook and written slowly that he thought he was beginning to understand why people made such a fuss about sign language as a way to talk. She had read that and laughed. A nearly silent laugh, the kind that lives mostly in the shoulders, and written back that he had chosen the most useful possible second language, and he had felt, sitting there in the small lamplight, that something had settled between them which seemed both irreversible and entirely right. They had seen each other nearly every day since, in the evenings after work, at this cafe or the Indian restaurant they had discovered they both preferred, or walking along the river on evenings when the weather allowed. She would teach him signs, and he would practice them back, sometimes correctly, sometimes in ways that made her press her lips together against a smile, and he would correct himself and try again, in the slow, unhurried rhythm of learning a new thing in a person's company had become, without his planning it, one of the better parts of his week. He had noticed things about her the way you notice things about someone when you're watching more carefully than usual, which he had been doing, he could admit to himself now, since at least the third week. He had noticed that she held her coffee cup with both hands, even in warm weather, and that she had a way of pausing just before signing something. A brief stillness that meant she was choosing her words with care, the way a person does when they understand language to be a more delicate and precise instrument than most people bother treating it as. He had noticed that she laughed easily and without pretense. The laugh of someone who had not learned to perform feeling for other people's comfort, and that she was direct in a way he found quietly remarkable, honest without being hard, present in a way that made the conversation feel as though it were actually going somewhere. Standing on a train platform one evening, waiting for the doors to open, he had turned all of this over in his mind and arrived, without great drama, at the understanding that what he was feeling for Hannah was not friendship. It had not come as a surprise, exactly. It had arrived the way rain arrives when you have watched the sky all afternoon. Not suddenly, not shockingly, just a thing appearing that you had understood was coming and finding yourself standing in it regardless. So he had sat down across from her that Thursday evening, in the cafe with the small lamp and the rain making its soft commentary on the window, and he had decided, not impulsively, but with the settled calm of someone who has thought about something long enough that the thinking part is finished, that tonight he was going to tell her. Not in a notebook, not in a text message, not in the careful neutral distance of typed words that could be deleted and reconsidered before they reach anyone. He was going to sign it to her in the language she had taught him in the lamplight, with his hands moving in the air between them. And he was going to mean it, and let whatever happened next be what it was going to be. He waited for a natural pause in the conversation, one of those small, comfortable silences they had long since learned to rest inside rather than fill, and then his hands moved. He signed to her that he liked her, not as a friend, not as a teacher, not as the person he had met by improbable good fortune over a spilled drink in a cold park, but in the other way, the way that had been growing through the whole of the past month, through every evening and every lesson and every quiet thing he had noticed about her. He watched her face as the signs fell between them like something irrevocable. He saw the exact moment she understood, a slight parting of the lips, a stillness different from her usual thoughtful pauses, something opening briefly in her expression, and then, almost immediately, something more complicated rising to meet it. She looked at him for a long, unhurried moment, and then at the table, and then at the rain on the window, and then back at him again, and her eyes were bright with something he recognized as the beginning of tears, and her hands were folded in her lap in the way he had come to know meant she was holding something she had not yet decided how to carry. She signed to him slowly, with great care, in the deliberate way of someone making certain every word arrives at its destination. She told him she was glad. He could see that she meant it, that he had said this to her. Her hands told him she cared for him, that the month had been something she had not been prepared for when she first gave him her email address in that cold park, that she had not expected any of this when the afternoon started. And then, with the same care and the same slowness, she told him that she couldn't. Not wouldn't. She seemed to want him to understand, couldn't, which is a different thing entirely, and which she signed in a way that asked him to hold the difference carefully. She admitted that it had happened before, that she had turned away men who came to feel this way about her, always for the same reason, always accompanied by this same sadness on both sides. She told him through her hands that what they had, the easy meetings, the lessons, the warmth of these evenings, felt to her like something rare, something that had taken its time to grow and deserved protecting, and that once you changed it into something else, you could not always change it back. She confessed, signing the word plainly and without embarrassment, that she was afraid that a relationship would take what they had built and quietly dismantle it, and that they would find themselves left with neither the friendship nor the thing they had tried to make of it. She was crying a little by the time she finished. Not dramatically, just the slow, private kind of tears that come when a person is telling the truth about something that costs something to say. She reached across the table and laid her hand briefly over his, once, in a gesture that was both apologetic and fond, and then folded her hands back and looked at him steadily, waiting to see what he would do with all of it. Kenji sat with it. He sat with the refusal, which had been gentle, and the reason behind it, which had been careful, and the way she had told him, which was, and this was the part he kept returning to, the way you tell something to someone whose feelings you are actually taking seriously. She had not been dismissive, had not been distant, had not offered him the polite, formal version of a no that leaves a person feeling as though they have been processed by an institution that does not quite know their name. She had been sad and present and honest, and she had held his hand for a moment, and those things taken together told him something he found he could not simply set aside. He found himself thinking that this was the kind of refusal you give when you're trying to protect something, not when you feel nothing, but when you're afraid of what might happen to the feeling you already have. He nodded slowly, without any performance of acceptance, simply letting her know he had heard every word. He signed back to her that he understood, not in the way of someone retreating, not in the way of someone arranging his face for the long walk home, but simply, honestly, in the way of someone who has received something and is holding it with care. He signed that he wasn't going anywhere. He meant that. Later, walking back through the wet evening toward the station, the two of them side by side in the comfortable quiet they had developed over the past month without planning it. Kenji turned the conversation over in his mind the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath it. He understood her fear, could follow the logic of it clearly, could see exactly the shape of what she was trying to preserve and why the effort of preserving it had made her cry. But what he couldn't quite arrive at was the feeling that she was right. What they had, as far as he could make out, was already something. Not ordinary friendship, not the easy, comfortable thing that word usually described, but something with its own texture and its own particular weight that had grown with a steadiness which felt like the opposite of fragile to him. He thought about the 37 signs, the evenings, the borrowed book still sitting on his coffee table with its careful diagrams of hands held just so. He thought about the way she had looked the first time he signed to her across a cafe table, that particular stillness, that warming behind her eyes. And he thought that what she was trying to protect had perhaps already become the very thing she was afraid of, and that she knew that, and that this was exactly what was frightening her. At the station, they paused in the usual way, in that brief neutral moment before the stairs took them in different directions toward different platforms, different trains, different neighborhoods of the same city. She looked at him, and her expression had the quality of a face feeling more than one thing at once, and having decided to let all of it be visible. He signed goodnight to her, one of the first signs she had ever taught him back when he was still working from the book, and she signed it back to him and turned and went down the stairs, and he stood for a moment in the warm air of the station, looking at the place where she had been. He found himself thinking that he had expected the evening to feel harder, and then found himself understanding why it hadn't, because some quiet part of him had already known, even sitting in the cafe before he signed a single word, that this was not an ending. On the train home, standing in the gentle sway of the evening commute, he thought about every man who had come before him, everyone she had said the same no to, always for the same reason. And he understood that she had been carrying this particular fear for a long time, that it had probably settled in her long before she had ever met him, back in the years when she was still finding ways to explain it to herself. He thought about how carefully she had spoken, the slowness of it, the way her hands had moved so that he would not miss a word. He thought about the fact that she had cried and that she had held his hand, and then he looked out the train window at the wet city going past and felt something settle in him quietly. The way a room settles after the lamp is lit and the window closed against the cold. He was not going anywhere. The no had arrived and the certainty had not moved. And he sat with that simple fact the way you sit with something you have just learned about yourself. Not with triumph, just with the quiet interest of someone who finds they know something now that they did not know before. He decided not to tell his sister yet, because she would have a great deal to say very quickly, and he wanted to keep this feeling private inside him a little longer. This particular calm of knowing what he was doing, even before he could explain it to anyone else. Outside the window, Tokyo moved past in the way it does at night. Lit windows and tall buildings, wet streets carrying soft reflections of orange and white, the small bright interiors of convenience stores that are always open, always somehow reassuring to see in passing. It was an ordinary Thursday evening in an ordinary city, and a man named Kenji was riding home on a train, thinking about a woman named Hannah, and the signs he already knew and the ones he would learn next. The refusal had been gentle, and the reason behind it had been careful, and her hand on his had been warm, and he sat with all of it and found that it left him not discouraged but steady, the particular steadiness of someone who knows where they're going even if the exact path is not yet entirely clear. And that, for the moment, seemed like exactly enough. The rain was still falling when he reached home, that same unhurried rain that had started at the cafe window, the kind with no particular ambition beyond being rain, falling softly on the city and letting the city be a little more itself for it. He made tea and sat for a while at his small table without turning on the television, listening to the rain and not thinking about anything in particular, or perhaps about everything at once in the way that sometimes feels if you let it, like a kind of rest. He opened the sign language book and turned to the next section he hadn't tried yet. New signs with their careful arrows and their diagrams of hands held at particular angles. And he studied them in the quiet and practiced one slowly, and then another, and let the rain do the rest. Whatever was going to happen would happen at its own pace, in its own time, in the unhurried way that things happen when both people are being honest with each other and careful with what they have been given. He trusted that, in the same way he had come to trust the evenings and the lessons and the warm circle of lamplight on their table at the narrow cafe near the station. And perhaps, in a quiet room somewhere across the city, Hannah was sitting with the evening too, thinking about the careful hands of a man who had said everything she had spent years hoping no one would ever say to her, and finding, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that she could not quite bring herself to wish she hadn't. And that, perhaps, is where we will leave them tonight, each in their own room, each with the soft sound of rain, each carrying something new and unresolved and quietly, stubbornly alive. Let that moment rest now, settling like warmth after a long day finally comes to stillness. We stay with them a little longer in this same quiet night, the same soft darkness that has held everything so gently. There is no hurry here. Only the slow unfolding of one story, breathing at its own pace. If you need to take a slow breath now, please do. Let your shoulders soften. Let the weight of listening carry you a little further down into rest. The night is not finished yet, and neither is this story. It continues on, unhurried and close, just as the darkness outside deepens without rush, without end. Somewhere in a small Tokyo apartment, on a Wednesday evening when the November rain had settled in without hurry, a man named Kenji lay on his futon with a fever that had come on slowly all day and refused, by evening, to leave. He had noticed it first at his desk at work, a dull heat behind his eyes that made the screen swim a little, and he had told himself it was nothing, the way people do when they are embarrassed to be ill. By the time the train carried him home through the lit windows of other people's evenings, his legs felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. And when he finally lay down and pulled the duvet up to his chin, he understood that nothing was going to happen tonight except rest. He had sent Hannah a message, just a few typed words, nothing dramatic, something like came home early, not feeling great, and had not expected her to reply for hours because she was the kind of person who lived at a certain remove from urgency. But within 20 minutes, she was at his door. He heard the knock and lay there for a moment, wondering if he had imagined it. And then it came again, soft and unhurried, and he pulled himself upright with some effort and shuffled to the door in his socks. Hannah was standing in the hallway with a convenience store bag in each hand and her coat still damp from the rain outside, as she looked at him with the kind of quiet focus that asked nothing and offered everything. She stepped inside before he could motion her in, set the bags down on the kitchen counter, and began unpacking them with the calm efficiency of someone who had already decided exactly what was needed. Sports drink, rice porridge in a sealed container, a packet of throat lozenges, and Kenji noticed this last, a small plastic bottle of the particular brand of hand cream he used when the winter air dried out his skin. He had mentioned that hand cream once in passing 3 weeks ago, and she had remembered. He tried to tell her thank you in sign, his hands moving slowly in the narrow space between them, and she watched him and signed something back. Something warm, something that contained the word sit and the word okay, and he let himself be guided back to the futon. She brought him the sports drink and waited while he drank some of it. And then she sat on the edge of the tatami beside him, close enough that he could feel the slight coolness she had carried in from outside, still clinging to her sleeves. The lamp on the low shelf threw a yellow circle over them both, and outside the window the rain continued its quiet business, the city beyond in a soft haze of orange and gray. He watched her arrange the things she had brought with the same careful attention she gave to everything. Unhurried, methodical, like someone setting out the pieces of a game she intended to play for a long time. The fever made everything slightly unreal. The edges of the room softened, sounds arriving a half-second late, and Kenji lay back against his pillow and thought that there was something almost tender about being ill when someone was beside you. He had been ill plenty of times before, alone, and the aloneness had not troubled him especially. He was a person who had always been comfortable with his own company, but this was different, and the difference was not just the presence of another person. It was the presence of this particular person, in this particular room, on this particular rainy evening. She checked his temperature with a small thermometer from a bag. She had thought of that too, and showed him the reading, and made a face that managed to convey both mild concern and absolute confidence that he was going to be fine. He laughed a little, which made his chest ache, and she smiled at that. For a while, they simply rested in the quiet together, Hannah sitting cross-legged on the tatami with her phone in her lap, glancing up every few minutes to check on him, and Kenji lying with his eyes half open, watching the rain on the window and listening to the small sounds of the apartment settling around them. It was the most peaceful he had felt in weeks. And then, slowly, something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no particular moment he could have pointed to afterward and said, "There, that was when it changed." It was more like the way a tide turns, gradual and inevitable, the water moving in a different direction before you have quite noticed that it is doing so. He had been thinking, in the soft haze of the fever, about what he wanted to say to her. And the strange thing was that the fever had, in stripping away his usual caution, made the wanting more visible, not less. He had wanted to say it for some time. Not a week, not 2 weeks, but since somewhere in that month they had spent learning the shape of each other, learning the grammar of a shared life conducted in signs and written words and the particular weight of a long look. He had tried once before, in sign, and his hands had refused him, not for lack of vocabulary, exactly, but because what he felt was not precise. It was large and unruly and resistant to being organized into clean gestures. The fever, it turned out, had stripped something away. All the caution he usually carried, the careful way he measured what he said before he said it, the habit of considering how a thing might land before he let it leave his hands, all of it had softened in the heat of the day, and what remained underneath was just the feeling itself, plain and insistent, looking for a way out. He sat up slowly. Hannah looked up from her phone and tilted her head in a question, and he reached past her for the notepad he kept on the low shelf, the same notepad they had used in the early days, before his sign language was good enough, when everything between them passed through ink on paper. She watched him pick up the pen. He thought for a moment about where to begin, and then he simply began. He wrote about the park first, the November cold, the bench he had chosen for no particular reason, the sound of juice hitting the ground before he saw where it had come from. He wrote about the moment he had understood she couldn't speak, and how ordinary that understanding had felt, which had surprised him, because he had expected some kind of awkwardness and instead had felt only a mild curiosity and an inexplicable desire to share his opinion about a soft drink. He wrote about the early evenings at the cafe, the slow weeks of emails, the way communication through text had gradually stopped feeling like a limitation and had started feeling like its own kind of closeness, slower perhaps than speech, but no less real for that. He wrote about the day he had borrowed the sign language book from his sister without telling Hannah, studying it in the evenings at his desk with the lamp on and the city quiet outside, getting things wrong and starting over the way you do when something matters enough to be worth getting wrong. Hannah sat very still. She had stopped looking at her phone. She was watching him write, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression was the one she wore when she was paying close attention, a kind of open, unhurried focus that he had come to think of as one of the most beautiful things about her. He filled the first page and turned to the second. On the second page, he wrote about courage. Not his own, particularly, but the courage he had seen in her. The ease with which she moved through a world built for people who could hear, the way she had told him in that cafe that live music was extraordinary if you could feel the sound pressure in your chest. The way she had said it not as a brave thing, but as a simple fact, the way truly brave things are often delivered. He wrote that he had thought about deafness in the months since they had met, more carefully than he had ever thought about anything he did not share himself. And what he had come to understand was that it was not a silence between them at all. It was simply a different channel, and the signal that traveled through it was entirely clear. Everything he needed to know about what she was feeling, he had learned through her face, her hands, the particular angle of her shoulders when she was tired or happy or thinking through something difficult. He had never needed to hear her voice to know her. He turned to the third page. His handwriting was getting slightly untidy. The fever was still there, a warmth behind his temples, and his hand was not entirely steady. But he kept going because stopping now felt like the wrong thing to do. He wrote about fate, which was not usually a word he used, because he was practical by nature and mildly suspicious of large romantic concepts. But lying here in the lamplight with the rain on the window and Hannah beside him on the tatami, he could not find a more accurate word for the particular chain of unremarkable events that had brought them to this room on this night. A cold park bench, a can of juice, a shared opinion about a soft drink that most people didn't understand. He wrote, "I don't know if I believe in fate, but I know that I was sitting in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And so were you, and I know that what followed was not nothing." He could feel her watching him, though he did not look up. The apartment was very quiet, the rain steady against the glass, the lamp holding its small, warm circle around them both. On the fourth page, he wrote what he had been building toward all along. Not dramatically, not with any particular preamble, simply the thing itself, plainly stated the way plain things deserve to be stated. He wrote that he had tried to say this in sign, and his hands had failed him. Not because his hands were bad, but because what he wanted to say was too large for any gesture he had learned yet, and perhaps for any gesture he would ever learn. He wrote that being with her had changed something in him. Not a dramatic change, not a sudden one, but the slow, steady kind that only reveals itself when you try to remember what things were like before and find that you can't quite manage it. He wrote, "The deafness is not the barrier between us. It never was. The only barrier was me, being slow, being uncertain, being the kind of person who needs several months to say a simple thing. He wrote, "I want to be with you. I am asking you properly on paper in this lamplight with a fever and unsteady handwriting to consider it." He wrote, "I know it isn't simple. I know there will be things we have to figure out that other couples don't. I'm not pretending otherwise, but I think we have already been figuring them out quietly without quite naming it." He wrote, "You came here tonight with hand cream." He set the pen down. He had filled 4 small pages of the notepad, front and back on some of them, his handwriting shrinking as he went, getting slightly more urgent without getting louder, the way written things do when the writer is leaning into them. He held the notepad out to her. Hannah took it. He watched her face as she read, watched her eyes moving across the page in that steady, unhurried way she had, the lamp catching the edges of her expression as it shifted. She read the first page and her brow softened. She read the second page and she was very still. She turned to the third page slowly, and Kenji, watching her, noticed that the fever seemed to have receded slightly, as though his body had decided this moment required him to be as present as possible and had arranged its temperature accordingly. When she reached the passage about fate and the park bench and the shared opinion about a soft drink, the corner of her mouth moved just slightly and then settled back into stillness. She turned to the 4th page. He did not look away. He watched her read the last page, and he watched the moment when she reached the part about the hand cream, and something in her face changed in a way he did not have a name for, a kind of arrival, as though she had been traveling toward a place without knowing where it was, and had suddenly recognized it. Her eyes filled. She did not try to prevent it. Hannah was not the kind of person who fought her own face. She simply let it happen, the tears coming quietly, without drama, the way genuine things tend to arrive. She held the notepad for a moment longer, looking at the last page, and then she looked up at him, in the lamplight, with the rain behind her and 4 pages of his handwriting in her hands. She looked at him for a long moment, and the room was very quiet, and the lamp burned steadily, and there was nothing anywhere that needed to be hurried. And then she nodded. It was a small movement, just a slow, certain lowering and lifting of her head, but contained everything, agreement and relief, and the particular kind of happiness that arrives not as an explosion, but as a slow warmth spreading outward from somewhere deep inside the chest. Kenji let out a breath he had not quite known he was holding. The rain continued on the window, entirely indifferent to them, which felt right somehow. The world going on in its ordinary way, while something small and permanent was decided in a pool of lamplight on a Wednesday evening in a small Tokyo apartment. Hannah set the notepad down carefully on the tatami beside her, as though she intended to keep it, and then she reached over and placed her hand on his. Her fingers cool from the November air, his warm with the remnants of the fever, and she held it there, quietly, without any need to say more. There was nothing more that needed saying. He lay back against his pillow with her hand still holding his, and the lamp made its warm circle, and the rain came and went against the glass. And outside, Tokyo moved through its evening in the way Tokyo does, a million lit windows and a million small eyes. And somewhere in all of it, Two people had just agreed to something. Much later, after she had pressed her palm gently to his forehead to check the fever and found it slightly less than before, after she had made sure the sports drink was within reach and the blanket was tucked in at the sides, the way you tuck in a blanket when you intend for someone to stay warm for a long time, she settled herself at the foot of the futon and they sat together in the quietest possible way. The notepad rested on the tatami between them, his handwriting visible on the top page, slightly cramped and earnest and not entirely steady. He thought that it was perhaps the most important thing he had ever written and also the most embarrassing, and that both of those things were fine. Hannah glanced at him once more before the evening settled fully into night, and whatever was in her expression at that moment, gratitude or tenderness, or the quiet pleasure of having been genuinely surprised by another person. He kept the shape of it somewhere careful, in the way you keep things you don't want to lose. Outside, the November rain went on, unhurried and even the way rain does when it is all the time in the world. And inside, the lamp burned steadily, and the fever continued its slow retreat, and a man named Kenji rested in the simple warmth of having said the thing he had needed to say. And that for one Wednesday evening in November was more than enough. Let that moment rest where it has settled, soft and still, like the last note of a song that no one wants to end too quickly. We stay with them a little longer in the quiet that follows, the kind of quiet that asks nothing of you. If you feel yourself growing heavy, let that heaviness be welcome. There is no hurry here, no reason to hold yourself awake. The night continues, slow and unhurried, and so does this story, folding gently forward into the hours ahead. Take a slow breath now, and let your shoulders drop, and when you are ready, or even if you are not quite ready, the story will carry you with it softly into what comes next. On a mild winter evening, in a narrow residential lane, a young man named Kenji was making his way slowly toward Hannah's family home, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his step more measured than it looked from the outside. He had walked this route before, past the corner convenience store, past the low stone wall with the persimmon tree that had long since lost its leaves. But tonight the lane felt narrower somehow, the ordinary houses on either side a little more attentive than usual. He and Hannah had agreed to meet at the end of her block, and when he rounded the last corner, she was already standing there, her breath making small pale clouds in the cold air, her scarf wrapped twice around her neck in the deliberate way she always wore things. She saw him, and her face arranged itself into the look he had come to recognize over these weeks, steady and warm. The particular composure she carried not as a performance, but as a kind of second skin, the belonging quality of someone who has learned to be calm from the inside out. She signed something he read as a gentle tease about men who look as though they are walking to their own funerals, and he laughed, a real laugh, a surprised one, and the knot in his chest loosened by about half. Yuki, Hannah's mother, met them at the door and was immediately, warmly, almost embarrassingly kind, insisting they come in from the cold, asking whether they had eaten, already moving toward the kitchen before they had quite finished removing their shoes in the genkan. The genkan, that small entryway every Japanese home keeps. the liminal place where you leave the outside world behind, smelled faintly of cedar and something savory from dinner. And Kenji stood there a moment longer than necessary, adjusting the placement of shoes with unnecessary care, not quite ready to go further. Hannah touched his sleeve, gently, and he followed her down the short hallway toward the faint sound of the house settling and the particular quality of silence that lives just around a corner from something difficult. Hiro was in the living room. He was a broad, solid man in his late 50s, settled in his chair with the stillness of someone who is not waiting but watching, who has already decided, before you have said a word, that he will see what you are made of before he makes up his mind about you. The television was off, Kenji noticed, turned off deliberately or never turned on, which meant this evening had been arranged with intention, every detail of it considered in advance, which was both a reassuring sign of seriousness and not reassuring at all. Kenji introduced himself with a small, earnest bow, and Hiro received it with a nod that gave nothing back, not unkind precisely, but unsponsored, a nod that said, in its way, "I see you, and I will decide what I think of you in my own time." They sat, all four of them, around the low wooden table, and Yuki brought tea with both hands and a smile that worked hard to smooth the weather in the room, and Kenji was grateful for that small effort in a way he could not quite have named. Kenji had prepared, quietly, a shape for what he wanted to say. Not a speech exactly, more the outline of certain truths he cared about, and how to arrange them so they would land honestly. But when Hiro spoke first, the shape dissolved cleanly, the way a held breath does. Hiro spoke in a low, measured voice, addressing Kenji without preamble, and what he said, not cruelly, but with the blunt, undecorated weight of a man who has watched his daughter meet the world's carelessness for 30 years, was this. Raising a child who could not hear had asked things of him that most fathers never had to give, and what he needed to know before any further conversation was whether the young man sitting across from him understood what it would actually mean, in all its daily particulars, in all its seasons, to spend a lifetime alongside a woman who lived in silence. It was the word lifetime that landed heaviest, Kenji would later recall. Not said to wound, but set down deliberately, the way you place a heavy stone on a table so that someone can feel its weight before you ask them to lift it. And what Kenji did then was the honest thing, which was also the frightening thing. He said, carefully, in the halting sign language he had been learning for barely a month, using his hands so that Hannah could follow, that he could not tell Hiro when they might marry, that he could not promise a timeline, and that there was even the real and human possibility that things between them might someday not last. He said he thought honesty mattered more than comfort, that he would rather offer the true thing than the reassuring one, and that he believed Hannah deserved at least that much, at minimum. He said it, and the room was very quiet, and the quiet had a texture to it, the kind of quiet that gathers when something irreversible has just been admitted to a room. Hiro looked at him for a long moment, the way you regard something you're not quite sure how to categorize, and then said, not warmly, not coldly, but with the precise edge of someone who is not finished yet, that he was not entirely sure, with that level of commitment, what exactly Kenji thought he was doing here, sitting at this table, asking for anything at all. And Kenji had no clean answer for that, which was the worst part of it. The part that followed him down the hallway when they eventually said goodnight and out into the cold and all the way home on the quiet streets. The night after and the night after that, Kenji sat with the question in his apartment. Not Hiro's question exactly, but the version he had turned into his own, which was simply, do I actually know what I'm agreeing to? And am I the kind of person who could do this? He had been honest, and honesty had not seemed like enough. The father's doubts sat in the room of his thinking like furniture, solid and unapologetic, and he could not quite find the angle to argue his way around it, because there was a part of it he half believed himself. He thought about the things he genuinely could not promise. Not because he didn't care, but because promising a whole lifetime at 2 months felt like the kind of thing only a liar would do with ease. And he was not a liar, and he did not want to begin by becoming one. He thought about the sign he had made for marriage, 2 hands brought carefully together at the wrist, and how his fingers had trembled slightly doing it, just slightly, just enough that he had noticed, and whether Hannah had noticed it too, and what she had thought if she had. And then, a few evenings later, they met at the small cafe near her building, the one with the low chairs and the window that fogged pleasantly in winter, and sat across from each other with their tea. And Hannah slid her phone across the table. What she had written, in the careful and unhurried way she always wrote, was this, that she had been thinking about the meeting with her father, and specifically about the moment Kenji had said the thing that embarrassed him most, that he could not promise a timeline, that separation was a possibility, and she wanted to say something about that particular moment. She wrote that all her life she had been spoken to carefully, managed, gently softened, that people who loved her chose the kind thing over the honest one, reflexively, without even noticing they were doing it, because they believed that was what kindness meant when you cared for someone who was different. And it was, in its quiet way, a kind of loneliness to always receive the polished version of what people actually thought, to sense the shape of the withheld thing without ever being given the thing itself, to be treated as though honesty might break you, when in fact it was the only thing that could ever fully reach you. When Kenji had sat in her father's living room and said the words that scared him, the uncertain words, the ones that made him look like less than he wanted to look, that was the first time in a long while that she had felt fully met, as a person the world trusted to handle the real version of things. She slid the phone back and looked at him across the low table and waited with the patience she had always had and he had always, quietly, admired. He read the message twice. The second time without quite meaning to, the way you reread something that has reached you before your mind has finished understanding it, the words still moving somewhere inside you after your eyes have stopped. He thought about what she had written and how plainly she had written it, with no decoration and no performance, with the precise, unhurried dignity of someone who had worked out, long ago, that plain speech was itself a form of deep respect. And he felt something settle in him, not the giddy relief of a crisis resolved, but the deeper kind, the shift that happens not through argument, but through understanding, when you stop trying to arrive somewhere and simply find that you already have. He thought about all the places he had imagined the difficulty might lie, the logistics, the different worlds, the daily patience the communication would ask of him, and how, sitting across from Hannah in that fogged-up cafe corner, those things still felt real, but somehow peripheral beside the point of the thing that actually mattered. He thought, she's asking me for the honest version of myself, and I've been giving her the honest version of myself, even when it was ungainly, even when I fumbled the signs and had to backtrack and try again. And perhaps that is not nothing, perhaps that is even something worth holding on to. He typed back and passed the phone across the table, that he understood, that he was grateful she had told him, that he wanted to keep being the honest version of himself with her, especially in the moments when it cost him something. She read it and gave the small single nod she reserved for things that had landed correctly, and returned quietly to her tea, which was itself a kind of acceptance, the best kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Outside the cafe window, the city continued in its evening way. People heading home, a delivery bike passing, a light rain beginning without any announcement, the gentle, persistent kind that doesn't wait to be noticed before it starts. They stayed at the table a little longer than necessary, not rushing to fill the space or reach the next subject, simply occupying the same warm corner together the way two people do when the difficult conversation has already happened and what remains is only the ease that follows honesty. On the walk home, their routes diverged a few blocks from the cafe, and they had a small standing ritual of waiting at the corner until one of them finally turned to go. Kenji found himself thinking about Hiro again, but differently now. Not as a challenge he had failed, but as something that had been given to him. The weight of those 30 years, the love that makes a person fierce when they are afraid for someone they have spent their whole life protecting from the world's inattention. A father who asked that question was a father who had been paying close attention for 3 decades, who knew precisely what the world could do to his daughter and was not going to hand her carefully to the first person who showed up looking earnest and willing. That made a kind of sense Kenji could respect, he thought, not from where he was standing tonight exactly, but as the beginning of something he would need to grow into over a long time, and he found he did not resent the weight of it. He turned at the corner and walked home in the light rain, not minding it, his coat growing slightly damp at the shoulders, his hands in his pockets, and his posture a little lower than it had been on the way out. The particular ease of someone who has been carrying something and has, at least for now, set it down. In his apartment, he made tea that he mostly didn't drink and sat at his small table and thought about the word lifetime, about its weight, yes, but also about the way a word's weight changes when you stop running from it and simply let it rest beside you for a while. He thought about what Hannah had given him in that cafe. Not a lesson about deafness, not about patience exactly, but about the older and simpler idea that honesty is not something you do to the people you love, but something you do for them. The thing that makes care actual, the thing that makes it hold. He had probably known this in some part of himself that was older than strategy, he thought, and perhaps the whole week of spiraling had been his way of traveling the long route to something he had already been moving toward, arriving finally at the place he had always been heading. Outside, the rain continued in its quiet, indifferent way, not asking anything of the city, just settling over it slowly and thoroughly, the kind that wets everything and is simply gone by morning, leaving the streets cleaner and the air cooler and the world a little more itself than it was before. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in a small room under a warm lamp, Hannah was still awake. He would learn this from a message that arrived around 11, sitting at her desk with one of the photography books they had recently started sharing between them. She had sent the message simply to say that the rain had started and she found it pleasant, and he had replied that he had been walking in it and found it the same, and the exchange was small and ordinary, and exactly the kind of small, ordinary thing that, repeated enough times across enough evenings, quietly becomes the whole of a life. And so the evening closed, not with any great declaration, not with promises too large and too early to carry, but with something quieter and perhaps more durable. Two people who had decided, each in their own way, to keep offering each other the honest version of themselves, and to trust that version was enough. The rain outside continued past midnight, gentle and unhurried and clean, settling over the neighborhood, without caring who was awake to hear it, touching the low stone walls and the bare persimmon tree in the narrow lane where a young man had walked a little nervously just a few hours before. And if that was where things rested for tonight, it was a good enough place to rest. Let that moment rest now. Let it settle the way a held breath finally releases slow and without effort into the quiet around you. The night has not changed. The same soft dark holds everything, and we stay with them a little longer in the space between one feeling and the next, where nothing is required of anyone. You can breathe here gently, no hurry at all, just the rhythm of the story moving forward the way water moves, without force, finding its way. And as the stillness deepens around you, the same night continues to unfold, carrying us a little further into what comes next. On a winter evening, a young man named Kenji walked the last few minutes toward a house he had been thinking about all week, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his breath making small, soft clouds that dissolved ahead of him into the dark. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that neighborhoods become quiet when everyone has come home and closed their doors against the cold, and the lamps along the lane made long reflections on the pavement, orange and slow. He had walked this same route several times before, and he knew without counting that it was about 10 minutes from his own apartment, though tonight those 10 minutes seemed to pass in a different way, shorter in the body, longer in the mind. When he reached the house, it was Yuki who came to the door, Hannah's mother, and she was already smiling, the particular warm smile of a woman who has decided to be gracious regardless of how the evening goes. She said that it must have been cold outside, said it with the gentle concern people use when they want someone to feel welcome before anything difficult begins, and Kenji was grateful for it, even though it did not quite reach the knot in his chest. She led him inside, through the small entryway and into the living room, where there was a low table and cushions on the tatami and a teapot already placed at the center, as though she had been quietly insisting, through the arrangement of cups, that this would be a civilized evening no matter what happened. Hannah was there, sitting near the far wall, and she gave him the look he had come to recognize over the past 2 months, the one that meant she was nervous and was trying not to show it, the one that arrived at her eyes a half-second before the calm expression she arranged over it. And at the head of the table sat Hiro, Hannah's father, with the particular stillness of a man who has already made up his mind about something and is waiting for the conversation to confirm it. His expression was not angry. Exactly. It was something heavier and more considered, the expression of a person who has spent 30 years watching the world be careless with someone he loves, and who has learned to read danger in ordinary things. On the walk over, Kenji had rehearsed what he might say, careful, reasonable versions of himself, versions that were composed and persuasive and arrived with every sentence in its proper place. But sitting down across from Hiro, with the warm lamp and the tatami and the three faces watching him, he found that all those rehearsed versions had simply gone quiet, and what remained was just himself, a 33-year-old man who had not planned to fall in love this particular autumn, but had, and did not know how to make that sound more impressive than it was. He began by saying he would like to speak first, and Hiro gave a slow nod that was more patience than permission. Then Hiro spoke, and what he said was the kind of thing that fathers say when they have been awake in the night with their worry for a long time. That raising a daughter who could not hear had been the work of 30 years, that the world had required her to be stronger than it should have, and that whatever Kenji thought he understood about that difficulty was probably a fraction of the real thing. He asked, quietly but without softness, whether Kenji could say honestly that he was prepared to carry that difficulty for the rest of his life. Kenji listened to all of this, and he did not look away. And then he answered in the only way that had ever seemed possible to him, which was to say the true thing rather than the reassuring one. He said that he could not tell them with certainty when or whether they would marry, and that he could not promise there would be no difficult days ahead, and that, as with any two people, the future might hold things neither of them had planned for. He said these things quietly, signing where his hands were steady enough and speaking where they were not, because he wanted Hannah to be able to follow every word of this conversation about her own life. And then he said the part that mattered most, that whether or not Hannah could hear, whether or not she spoke, had nothing to do with why he was sitting in this room tonight. That what he felt had come from learning who she was one typed message at a time, one meal at a time, one laboriously practiced sign at a time, and that none of those things had anything to do with a disability and everything to do with her specifically, the person she was, the particular way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she had written in that first email that she had never met anyone else who liked Dr. Pepper. Hiro did not soften immediately, and Kenji had not expected him to. The father said that good intentions were not enough, that loving someone and being able to build a life with them were different matters, and that a young man who said he could not promise the future was not the kind of man he had been hoping to hear from. There was a silence after that, the kind of silence that arrives when two people have both said what they came to say and neither is sure what comes next. It was Yuki who broke it, and she did so not toward Kenji but toward her husband. And what she said had clearly been waiting inside her for some time before it arrived. She observed, with a gentleness that had a certain precision to it, that in every conversation since Kenji had come into their daughter's life, Hiro had mentioned Hannah's deafness, and she asked whether he had noticed that the young man across the table had not mentioned it once. She said that the one who kept returning to what Hannah could not do was not the man who had learned to sign for her in a month. It was her husband, who loved their daughter deeply, but who had perhaps, without meaning to, taught Hannah to feel her own silence as a weight rather than simply a fact of her particular life. Hiro said nothing for a moment, and the room held the weight of that nothing in the way rooms do when something true has been said and everyone is waiting to see where it lands. Then, in the quiet that followed, something happened that no one in that room had planned for, and it came without announcement, the way the most important moments tend to arrive. Hannah had been sitting near the wall the entire time, watching the hands and the faces and the careful exchange passing between the people she loved, and her own hands had been still in her lap. But now she moved, and she did not reach for her phone or her iPad or any of the devices she used to build the bridges between herself and the world. She opened her mouth, and she used her voice. She had a voice. She had always had one. Technically, in the way that a person who has never played an instrument has fingers, but she had kept it sealed away for as long as most people in that room could remember, because the sound of it, to her own ears, had always felt like the most uncontrollable and exposed thing about her. The one place where her silence became a sound she could not shape into the words she actually meant. It was the thing she had once told Kenji about. In an email she had spent 3 days composing and then almost deleted, that she could hear herself trying and know that the result was not quite right. And so she had simply stopped trying long ago before the trying could become a new kind of shame. But now she spoke, her voice rough from disuse, cracking at the edges, and what she said, what those watching would piece together from the fragments they caught, and the signs she wove between the words like someone laying stepping stones across water, was something like this. She told her father that Kenji had been learning sign language for about 1 month, and she asked him to think about what that meant, not just the fact of it, but the particular texture of it. The evenings with a borrowed book from his sister, the practice in front of a mirror, the signs he got wrong, and the signs he got right. In the evening, he had shown her the book across the dinner table with a slightly embarrassed expression he always wore when he was being kind and did not want to. Make a ceremony of it. She said that in her experience, and she had been gathering that experience for 30 years, the people who learned sign language for her were the people who had already decided that she was worth the difficulty, not as a project, not as an act of charity, not to prove something to themselves, but simply because they wanted to be in the same room with her without a wall between them. She told her father that she had spent more years than she wanted to count believing that loving her was a burden she had no right to ask anyone to carry willingly, that every man who had come close and then left had confirmed something she had been afraid was true about herself. She said that she did not want to be with someone who arrived with a polished speech, who made beautiful promises that cost nothing, who had rehearsed the right words because the right words were a kind of protection. She had met people like that, and she had always known, before they knew themselves, that they would eventually leave. She said that she wanted someone honest enough to sit across from her father and say he did not know what the future held, because that was what honesty actually looked like, and she had been waiting her whole life for someone to show it to her without flinching. Her voice broke twice while she was saying all of this, and she did not stop. Hiro watched his daughter as she spoke, and the expression on his face had gradually changed. The careful guardedness of before had given way to something older and less defended, something that looked like a man remembering, with some surprise, how much time had passed. Yuki had put her teacup down some time ago and sat with her hands folded, her eyes bright and very still. Kenji sat without moving and watched Hana's face. And he thought, with the feeling that comes when you have understood something but not yet understood how much, that her voice, cracked and unsteady and entirely her own, was the most deliberate and careful thing she had ever given to anyone in that room, including him. After a long moment, Hiro looked down at the table, and then he looked at Kenji, and the hardness that had been in his face all evening had not disappeared entirely, but had settled into something that resembled tiredness, and underneath that, something that resembled respect. He said that he'd spent 30 years being afraid on behalf of a daughter who, it turned out, had grown into someone who no longer needed him to be afraid for her. He said that the honest answer Kenji had given, that he could not promise everything, only that he would try, was not a comfortable answer, but it was a real one, and he had been alive long enough to know the difference between those two things. He said that he was not yielding because the right things had been said, but because his daughter had spoken aloud, in front of all of them, for the first time in many years, and that told him what no prepared speech ever could. He bowed his head, and he said, "Please take care of her," and the words came out slowly, each one set down with some weight behind it. Kenji bowed in return, lower than he had intended, and what he said when he straightened was that he could not promise to make Hana happy every day, but that he would try sincerely with everything he had, and that seemed to him to be the only honest thing left to say. Yuki went to put more water on, and the room breathed again, and Hana sat with her hands at her lap and looked at her father with the expression of a daughter who has just watched something difficult soften into something gentle. They stayed for dinner, and Hiro asked questions about Kenji's work, about how they had first met, about the sign language, about what their ordinary days together looked like. And the questions came more easily as the evening continued, the way a door that has been stiff will finally open when the pressure is patient enough. Yuki mentioned at some point that Hana was apparently far more helpful in the kitchen when Kenji was present than at any other time, and Hana assumed the dignified expression of someone who has been understood too accurately and is choosing not to comment on it. Kenji laughed, a real laugh, the first of the evening, and something in the room shifted in the way things shift when laughter arrives after a long tension, and everyone remembers they are people and not positions. When the time came to leave, he said his goodbyes at the door, and Hiro's handshake was firm, the handshake of a man who has arrived at a decision and is at peace with the arriving. Hana walked him to the gate, and they stepped out together into the cold, the night air sharp and clear around them, the lamp at the edge of the path making a small soft circle on the dark pavement. He said good night, and turned, and had taken perhaps 3 steps down the path when he heard something behind him, and he stopped. Her voice came out into the winter air, careful, slightly unsteady, the sound of something that had been held in a closed place for a very long time and was now, for the first time, being allowed outside. What she said an English speaker would recognize without difficulty as the words "I love you," though the vowels had their own particular shape, softer at the edges than those words usually are, and the sound had a roughness to it that was not uncertainty, but simply the roughness of a voice learning, after years of quiet, how to be used again. He heard it as clearly as he had ever heard anything. He stood in the cold for a moment, with the lamplight and the empty street and the sound of her voice still settling in the air around him, the way a note from a bell settles after the bell has stopped swinging. He turned back, and she was standing at the gate with her hands at her sides, looking at him with the expression of someone who has done something irreversible and is still deciding whether that is frightening or simply, finally, true. He smiled at her, not broadly, not the smile of triumph or relief, but the quieter smile that comes when something you had not quite allowed yourself to hope for arrives without announcement, in the cold, on an ordinary street. From somewhere inside the house, warm and slightly too far away to be entirely accidental, came the sound of Yuki's voice, and what she said had something to do with the cold and something to do with young people, and Hannah did not turn around. Later, on the walk home, with the cold air around him and the street lights making their long, still paths down the empty road, Kenji found that he was not thinking in words exactly, that the evening had settled in him not as a sequence of things that had happened, but as a single feeling, the feeling of something that had been carried carefully for a long time being finally, gently, set down on solid ground. The street was the same street it had always been, 10 minutes between two apartments in the same part of the city, and the night was cold and ordinary and entirely quiet, and none of that seemed to matter very much. Somewhere behind him, in a house where the lights were still on, a father was finishing the last of his tea, and a mother was moving softly in the kitchen, and a woman named Hannah was perhaps sitting in the warmth with her hands in her lap, thinking about a voice she had carried all her life and had, tonight, decided was not something to keep hidden anymore. And if the night had any opinion about all of this, about a month of sign language learned from a borrowed book, about a man who had said honestly that he could not promise everything, about a voice that had cracked open in a quiet room in front of the people who loved her most, the night kept that opinion to itself, in the way that winter nights do, patient and unhurried and holding everything gently in the cold. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests for tonight. And so, tonight's story comes to a close. All the threads have settled now, gently, like the last breath before sleep fully takes you. We have traveled far together, through quiet rooms and difficult choices, through the small, true moments that make up a life. And now we have arrived at the still end of it,